In 1899, in the city of Cincinnati, a probate attorney sat down to read the final inventory of an estate he had managed for 7 months. The widow had been present for every session. She had arrived with a leather folder. Inside were 31 years of household accounts, water rights agreements, and a single codicil, filed in the county recorder's office in 1884, that the attorney had hoped she would not know about. She had known about it since the day it was drafted. She had witnessed her husband sign it. She had made a note in the margin of her household book. She waited. She sat very quietly in the chair across from his desk. She did not raise her voice. She placed the folder on his desk and she opened it. This is the story of women like her. Not the famous ones, not the Vanderbilts or the Astors, whose names still echo through marble corridors and dedication plaques. This is the story of the ones history filed under miscellaneous, who appear in county court records and old newspaper notices only as the wife of, the widow of, the formerly known as. Women who had been, their whole lives, very carefully watched, and who had, in the watching, learned to be very careful in return. The stories you're about to hear are fictional, inspired by the real legal landscape of Gilded Age America. They are not intended as legal advice. The legal concepts used, dower rights, codicils, probate, quitclaim deeds, mineral rights, testamentary trusts, are drawn from the period and used for atmosphere and narrative accuracy. The women and families in these stories are composites, not portraits of specific individuals. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, please consider subscribing. New stories appear each week and the next one will be waiting when you return. The world we're entering tonight is the world of the Gilded Age, that long gaslit American afternoon that stretched from roughly 1870 to the early years of the 20th century. It was a world of tremendous wealth and tremendous anxiety about that wealth. Fortunes were made in a single generation. Railroads crossed the continent. Steel mills lit up the river valleys. And into the hands of men who had never before held more than a tradesman's ledger came sums that would have been incomprehensible to their grandfathers. With wealth came property, and with property, in those years, came a particular kind of danger. Not the danger of thieves with crowbars, but the quieter danger of paperwork, of executors, of codicils quietly added and codicils quietly omitted, of deed transfers that moved through the county recorder's office on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, of estate inventories from which certain mineral rights, or certain parcels of riverfront land, or certain income-producing properties had been somehow overlooked. Women in the Gilded Age occupied a complicated legal position. Before the Married Women's Property Acts, which passed in most states between the 1840s and the 1890s at different times and with different provisions, a wife's property belonged in most respects to her husband. After those acts the picture improved, but only in pieces. A widow might hold dower rights, a traditional claim to 1/3 of her husband's real property for the duration of her life. She might hold property in a separate estate, protected from her husband's creditors by an equity trust. She might be named in a testamentary trust, with income flowing to her from assets managed by a trustee. And in all of these arrangements the documents mattered enormously. The specific language of a codicil, the recording date of a deed, the precise wording of a trust instrument, these were not abstractions. They were the difference between a widow who could remain in her home and a widow who could not. Between a woman who held mineral rights beneath 400 acres of western Pennsylvania farmland, and a woman who was quietly told that those rights had reverted to the estate of a brother-in-law she had never particularly liked. The women in these cases understood this. They understood it the way women who have spent 30 years managing a household, while being told they are not managing it, learn to understand the architecture of the world around them. They kept records. They read the documents placed in front of them. They waited, sometimes for years, for the moment when their knowledge would be needed. They outlived, nearly all of them, the men who had underestimated them. Come in out of the evening air, the parlour is warm, there is a low fire in the grate and the smell of beeswax on the side tables, the particular quiet of a house that has been recently emptied of its noisiest occupant. Somewhere a pen moves across paper. Somewhere a woman is making a note in a leather-covered book. Let these 5 cases settle around you like the warmth of a room you have entered from the cold. There is no urgency here. These women have already done what needed to be done. We are only listening now to how it happened. There is a particular quality to the late afternoon light in an American house of the 1880s that is worth trying to describe before the story proper begins. It is not the sharp, clean light of morning, which announces itself and asks things of you. It is the light that arrives sideways through west-facing windows in the hour before supper, amber-tinted, warming the dust in the air above the parlour carpet, and the grain of the walnut furniture, and the glass faces of the framed photographs on the mantel. It settles. It does not shine on things so much as it reveals them, the way a thing is actually coloured, which is always slightly different from how it looks in harsher conditions. In that light, documents look different too. The paper of a deed or a codicil or an equity trust instrument, held at an angle in the late afternoon of a parlour, shows the texture of its manufacture, the laid lines of the paper mould, the slight unevenness of a surface that looked smooth in the morning. The ink, which appears black in daylight, shows itself as something closer to brown, the colour that black ink becomes over time when it has been absorbed into fibre and settled there, permanent now, irrevocable. These were the papers that mattered in the Gilded Age, in the lives of the women in this collection. Not the grand public documents, not the legislation that slowly extended women's property rights through the latter half of the 19th century, not the court opinions that established the precedents, not the newspaper reports that covered the notable cases. These mattered too, and they shaped the world in which these women lived. But the papers that determined each woman's specific situation were smaller and more ordinary. A codicil in a lawyer's folder, a deed in a county recorder's bound volume, a notebook entry in a woman's own handwriting in a lower drawer. The Gilded Age was, in its official mythology, an age of grand gestures and enormous fortunes and men of iron will who bent the world to their purposes. In the actual daily texture of its life, it was also an age of paperwork, of documents drafted and signed and filed and sometimes misfiled, and occasionally not filed at all, of estate attorneys who were reliable and estate attorneys who were not, of probate courts that kept records and clerks who processed those records with varying degrees of care. The women in these cases were not the official mythology, they were the actual texture. They were women who understood that the document in the drawer was more immediately relevant to their lives than the grand narrative of economic expansion and social change in which they were living. They could not vote. In most cases, they could not practice law. They could not, in the early decades of this period, own property independently of their husbands in most jurisdictions, and in the later decades, the legal protections of the Married Women's Property Acts still required knowledge to invoke and attorneys to defend. What they could do, what some of them did consistently over long periods, was pay attention to the documents that concerned them and keep the documents that they needed to keep and know, when the moment came, what they had and where it was. This is not the story of dramatic legal battles, although some of these cases produced legal proceedings of various kinds. This is the story of the period before and after those proceedings, the long, quiet accumulation of attention that made the proceedings possible, and the long, quiet continuation of a life that followed them. 5 women, 5 houses in 5 cities, 5 different sets of documents in 5 different places. 5 lives that moved forward through the ordinary years of the Gilded Age, the suppers and the household accounts and the morning correspondence and the afternoon tea and the evening fire, while also, simultaneously, maintaining the kind of attention to their affairs that allowed them to act when action was required. The Gilded Age produced its famous women, the society hostesses, the heiresses, the women who crossed the Atlantic to marry European titles, the suffragists, the writers. These women's names appear in the histories because they were visible in the ways that histories record. The women in these cases were not visible in those ways. They were visible only in the county records and the probate files and the equity trust instruments, and, in one case, a governess's employment journal now in a Chicago History Society's collection. They are worth knowing, not because their stories are exceptional. They are not, or not in the sense of being rare, but because they are representative of a kind of competence and a kind of persistence that the era had a complicated relationship with. The era celebrated women's accomplishments in domestic management, in charitable work, in artistic production. It was less comfortable with women's competence in financial and legal matters, which it preferred to consider the domain of men with offices and watch chains. These women simply proceeded as though this preference were not their concern, which was perhaps the most subversive thing about them. Come into the warm room. The fire is good tonight. the kind of fire that has settled from its earlier energy into a bed of coals that gives off steady heat without requiring attention, the kind of fire that makes the room feel inhabited rather than merely heated. The lamp on the side table provides what additional light is needed. Outside, whatever city this is, whichever of the 5 cities these 5 women lived in, the evening is settling in around the street lamps and the carriages, the particular quiet of a residential street in the 1880s, after the business day is done and before the later night begins. Sit down. There is no urgency here. These women did their work long ago and it is done, and what remains is the account of it, which we can take at whatever pace suits the evening. The house in Oughiogheny County stood on a slight rise above the Youghiogheny River, and in autumn, when the leaves came down from the hillside chestnuts and the maples along the property's edge, you could see the water from the second-floor landing. Not the full river, just a strip of it, pewter-coloured in the afternoon light, a horizontal line between the dark trees that suggested movement without quite revealing it. Margaret Prentiss Harlow noticed this every year. She would stand at the landing window with a cup of tea cooling in her left hand, watching the light shift on the water below, and she would think about the land. She had always thought about the land, not in a sentimental way. She was not a sentimental woman by disposition, but in the way of someone who understood that land was not merely the place where a house stood, but a living account, recording in its soil and its timber, and the rock beneath it the conditions of the lives conducted above it. Her father had been a surveyor in western Pennsylvania, a quiet man who had taught her, before she was 10 years old, to read a contour line on a map and to understand what the elevation told you about drainage, and what drainage told you about soil quality, and what soil quality told you about what might grow and what might be found beneath the surface. He had taught her not because he intended to make her a surveyor, but because he thought the world was more legible when you understood how to read it, and he thought everyone deserved a more legible world. She had carried this belief into her marriage, and into the management of the Harlow household, and into the writing table in the corner of her bedroom where she kept her accounts and her notebooks. It was a small writing table, walnut, with a slanted surface and a brass-handled drawer along the front, that had been her mother's, and which she had brought to the Harlow house when she married Josiah in 1860. Josiah had offered to have a larger one made. She had said this one suited her. It suited her because she knew where everything was in it, and because it was the right size for the kind of work she did at it, which was not decorative but practical. She had married Josiah Harlow at 22. He was a man of 35, already established in the county's commercial affairs through a partnership in a textile mill outside Pittsburgh, and through his management of the farm property that had been in the Harlow family since his grandfather's time. He was not her father's kind of man. He thought in quantities and transactions where her father had thought in contours and histories, but he was solid and fair, and he respected her intelligence, which in the 1860s was not something that could be taken for granted in a husband. He was also considerably louder than she was, in the particular way of men who have learned that decisiveness is more quickly recognized than accuracy, and who have built their professional reputations accordingly. She had found, in her years of marriage to him, that the two qualities were not as different as they first appeared, that his decisiveness and her accuracy were complementary rather than contradictory, the way a good piece of timber and a careful joint are complementary in a well-built structure. They lived well. The house above the river had been built in the 1840s and expanded by Josiah in 1871 when the mill partnership had become profitable enough to permit it. The addition gave them 2 more bedrooms, a proper dining room with enough wall space for the portraits that had been accumulating in the parlour, and a study for Josiah with a south-facing window that let in enough light to read by through the winter. The rooms were comfortable rather than grand. Parlour, dining room, kitchen, the study, 4 bedrooms on the upper floor, a back staircase used by the household staff. There were 3 servants, a cook, a housemaid, and a stableman who also managed the kitchen garden, and the household ran with the particular quiet efficiency that a house achieves when the person managing it is both thorough and undemonstrative. Margaret managed the household accounts herself. This was not unusual for women of her station in those years. What was perhaps slightly unusual was the precision with which she did it. She kept a main household ledger and 2 subsidiary notebooks, one for the domestic budget by category, one for correspondence and documentation relating to the property. Every invoice from the coal merchant, every receipt from the farrier, every quarterly statement from the mill trust, every letter from the tenant who farmed the lower 40 acres on a seasonal agreement. These were received, recorded and filed in the lower drawer of the writing table. She had divided the drawer with a series of pasteboard separators she had cut herself, one section for the mill trust materials, one for the farm tenancy, one for the household invoices, one for miscellaneous correspondence relating to the property, and one, at the back, for documents she considered significant but infrequent. Deeds, surveys, legal instruments, the kind of paper that arrived rarely and needed to be findable when it arrived. The lower drawer was deep. Over the years it accumulated the paper record of a household's life, contracts and receipts and letters and statements, the annual renewal notices from the tenants in their slightly smudged county clerk print, the survey plats she had asked her father to look over before he died in 1878, the original deed to the property from the Harlow estate records that she had quietly obtained a copy of from the county courthouse in 1885. She obtained that copy not because she expected to need it. Josiah was in good health in 1885, the mill was profitable, the tenants were reliable, but because she believed, in a firm and practical way that she never quite articulated even to herself, that a woman in her position ought to know what the documents said about what was hers. The coal survey arrived in the spring of 1880. In March of that year, a geological survey team came through the region. They were contracted by a consortium of Pittsburgh investors who were interested in the coal-bearing formations that had been identified in several western Pennsylvania counties over the preceding decade, and whose representatives moved through the area that spring making inquiries of landowners, taking rock samples from exposed formations along creek beds and hillside cuts, and filing preliminary reports with the consortium's geologists in Pittsburgh. It was not an unusual thing to encounter in those years. The coal industry's expansion through the 1870s had sent survey teams into most of the accessible hill country of western Pennsylvania, reading the rock the way Margaret's father had taught her to read a contour map, looking for what the surface suggested about what was underneath. A surveyor named Kettleworth appeared at the Harlow house on a Tuesday in late March. He was a spare, serious man who smelled of wet wool and chalk dust, and who presented his consortium's credentials to Josiah with the practiced efficiency of a man who has asked this particular favour many times. He requested permission to examine the hillside formations on the lower portion of the property, specifically the exposed limestone and sandstone along the creek that ran down from the eastern ridge to join the river. Josiah gave permission, with the easy confidence of a man who does not expect anything to come of such an examination. He offered the survey team the use of the stableman's shed for their equipment and a meal in the kitchen. Kettleworth thanked him and set up on the hillside for 3 days. They left on a Thursday morning. Josiah was in Pittsburgh for the day and Margaret saw them off herself. 3 men in rough work clothes loading their equipment into a wagon, Kettleworth pausing at the gate to remove his hat and say he appreciated the courtesy. She asked him, without particular urgency, what he had found. He said they had found what they had come looking for, but that it was too early to say more than that, and that a report would be filed with the consortium, and a copy would be sent to the landowner in due course. The report arrived in the second week of May. Josiah read it in his study, at the south-facing window, on an afternoon when the light was still warm enough to do without a lamp. The surveyor's language was measured and qualified, as geological survey language tends to be. It spoke of indications rather than certainties, of formations consistent with the presence of workable coal seams rather than confirmed deposits, of the advisability of further investigation by parties interested in subsurface mineral development. But between the qualifications the substance was clear enough. The formation beneath the Harlow property's eastern hillside was geologically similar to formations already producing coal in the neighbouring county. Josiah left the report on his desk. He went to supper. Margaret had been in the study that afternoon, at the writing table in the corner where she sometimes worked when the light in her bedroom was too grey in the late season. She had been there when Josiah came in and set the report down, and then been called away by the stableman about a matter with the feed stores. She had not read the report immediately. She finished the letter she was writing first, then she read it. She read it twice, slowly and carefully, beginning with the title page and ending with the appendix table of geological formation names, which she did not fully understand but which she could see from their arrangement supported the report's main finding. She made 2 notes in the small grey notebook she kept in the lower drawer. Not the main household ledger, but a secondary notebook she used for observations that did not yet have a category. The first note recorded the date, the survey team's name, the consortium's name, the substance of the report's main finding, and the filing reference printed in the upper right corner of the title page. The second note, on a new line, recorded her own interpretation, that if the formation was as described, the subsurface mineral rights beneath the eastern portion of the property might be of very significant value if the coal market continued on its current trajectory, and that this value was distinct from the surface property value and would need to be managed accordingly if the question ever arose. She replaced the notebook in the drawer. She put the report behind the notebook in the miscellaneous section with the other property-related correspondence. She went down to the kitchen to discuss the supper menu with the cook. She did not mention the report to Josiah. He had read it. He would decide what to do about it or not. She had made her note. Nothing happened for 7 years. This was not unusual. Geological surveys produced findings, findings produced interest, interest produced negotiations, negotiations moved slowly or not at all. The coal men were busy with properties that had already been drilled and assessed. The Harlow hillside was speculative terrain. It waited. The household continued. The seasons changed with the regularity that seasons have in river valleys, where the elevation contains them. Cold winters that came early and left slowly, wet springs that turned the lower field into a temporary lake for 6 weeks, summers of particular green beauty that Margaret had always thought were the reason people built houses on hillsides above rivers, and autumns like the one she always watched from the landing window, the water pewter-coloured below the bare trees. She kept her accounts. The mill trust statements came quarterly, the tenant's rent twice a year, the household invoices on a rolling cycle. She filed everything in the lower drawer. She reviewed the totals in the main ledger at the end of each month, carried the figures forward, noted any anomalies. There were rarely anomalies. The household was a well-run place, and well-run places tend to produce consistent accounts. In October of 1887, Josiah went to Pittsburgh for 2 days. He had appointments with Copperfield, his estate attorney, a man who had offices on Penn Avenue, and who was reliable and thorough in the way of attorneys who have been practicing long enough to have stopped trying to be imaginative. Josiah visited Copperfield perhaps twice a year for routine estate management matters, and the visits produced nothing that Margaret was not told about in general terms. He was not secretive about his affairs. He was simply a man who managed his affairs and reported to his wife about them in the manner of the era, which was to say he reported what he thought she needed to know, and made his own judgment about what fell into that category. He returned on the Thursday evening. He came in from the cold with the particular energy of a man who has accomplished something, and is settling into the satisfaction of having accomplished it. He accepted his supper and his tea, and he sat in the parlour afterward with the newspaper, and Margaret sat with her mending across from him, and they were quiet in the comfortable way of people who have spent enough evenings together that silence has become a form of company. She asked, without particular emphasis, whether there was anything from the Pittsburgh trip that she should be aware of with respect to the household's affairs. He said there was nothing to worry about. He said he had reviewed some of the estate arrangements with Copperfield, and that everything was in order. She asked whether the arrangements related to the property. He said they related to various things, and that the documents were technical, and that the main point was that the children, Edmund and Charles, 19 and 16 that autumn, would be properly provided for. He said it with the slight deflection of a man who has done something he is not sure he wants to discuss in detail, not because it is wrong, but because explaining it would require a longer conversation than the evening seemed suited for. She asked whether she should read the documents. He said she was welcome to read them if she wished. They were not secret, but that she would find them very dry. He was going to say more. She could see it in the way he held his teacup, the slight forward tilt of his posture that meant he was organising additional sentences. But then Charles came in from the kitchen with a question about whether his school fees could be paid by the end of the week, rather than the beginning of the next, and the conversation turned as household conversations with children will turn, and the documents were not mentioned again that evening. She wrote in her notebook that night, when she was back at her writing table, October 14th, 1887. Jay visited Copperfield in Pittsburgh, executed what appears to be an amendment or codicil to the estate arrangements relating to provision for Edmund and Charles, nature of amendment not fully disclosed, possibly relates to mineral rights given Surveyor's report of May 1880, obtain copy when possible. She obtained the copy 18 months later, in the spring of 1889, when Josiah went to Philadelphia for a week for a matter relating to the mill partnership's Eastern supplier arrangements. She did not search the study in his absence. She was not that kind of woman, and that was not her method. The codicil was in the second drawer of the large oak desk, in a folder alongside the original 1883 will, and she happened to be in the study one morning reviewing the tenant's latest letter about repairs to the lower barn, and she noticed the folder was slightly different from how it usually sat in the drawer, which made her take it out, and once it was in her hands she read it. She read it at the desk in the morning light that came through the south window in the good way it came in April, clear and warm and falling across the page at the angle that made reading easy. She read it completely without skipping. The codicil was dated October 13th, 1887, the day before Josiah had returned from Pittsburgh, which meant he had travelled specifically to execute it, which had not occurred to her before and which now seemed important. It concerned, precisely as she had suspected, the mineral rights beneath the Harlow property. The codicil severed those rights from the surface estate and placed them in a separate trust for Edmund and Charles, to be managed by Wallace Harlow, Josiah's younger brother, a manufacturer's agent in Pittsburgh, as trustee. The income from any future mineral lease was to be divided equally between the two sons upon each reaching the age of 25. She read it twice. She replaced it in the folder. She replaced the folder in the second drawer at the same slight angle she had found it. She went back to the writing table and picked up the tenant's letter about the lower barn and finished reading that. In the evening she wrote the codicil's provisions into her notebook. Not a summary, the specific language, the names, the dates, the trust terms, the trustee's identity, the distribution schedule, the filing reference. She had always found that writing something down exactly, rather than approximately, was a form of understanding it. It was a coherent arrangement. She could see the logic. Josiah had wanted to provide for the boys directly, separately from the general estate, and the mineral rights were the most valuable speculative asset available for that purpose. She did not think he had intended to harm her. She thought he had thought about the boys, and about the coal survey, and about providing for the next generation, and had not thought quite carefully enough about what the separate severing of those rights meant for her own position, which was a thing that happened when men planned for their children without quite including their wives in the planning. She returned the grey notebook to the lower drawer. The survey report from 1880 was behind it. The deed transfer from 1882 was behind that. She noted in the same moment of filing that the 1882 deed transfer, a routine conveyance that had moved a small portion of the riverfront land into the equity trust Josiah had established for her benefit in 1879, used language broad enough that a careful reading might include within it the mineral rights that the codicil was now attempting to sever. She was not certain of this. She was not a lawyer, but she noted it in the margin of her notation about the codicil. See 1882 deed transfer, possible overlap with equity trust consent provisions. She did not act on this. Josiah was alive. The codicil was a planning instrument. She had made her note and she would wait. Josiah died in November of 1891. The illness was a pulmonary inflammation, the kind that settles in the chest in late autumn and deepens through November if the cold is wet enough. He had been susceptible to chest complaints since his 40s, and they had never previously become serious. This one did. He was 57. He died on a Wednesday evening in the bedroom that looked west toward the ridge, with Edmund come from Pittsburgh and Charles arrived on the overnight train from the university, and the doctor sitting in the corner chair and the fire built up against the night air. The household entered the winter in the particular suspension that follows a death, the servants moving more quietly than usual, the meals simplified without anyone saying so, the morning routine continuing because routines do not know that something has changed, only people know. Margaret continued the morning accounts. She continued the review of the quarterly statements. She wrote the letter to the mill partnership's managers, informing them of Josiah's death and asking for confirmation of the trust income arrangements. She wrote to the tenant farmer about the next year's agreement. She kept the lower drawer in order. Edmund and Charles stayed for a week after the funeral. Edmund was 23 and working in a junior partnership in Pittsburgh, steady in the way his father had been steady. Charles was 20, still at the university, less certain of his direction but not adrift. They were both kind to her in the way of young men who have lost their father and are suddenly aware that their mother is a person as well as a presence. They asked if she needed anything. She said she had what she needed and she would write if that changed. They went back to their lives. Wallace Harlow presented himself at the house 3 weeks after the funeral. He came on a grey December morning that smelled of coming snow, in a hired carriage from Pittsburgh, accompanied by Copperfield, who carried his leather case with the ease of a man who has made this particular kind of visit many times. They were both civil. They sat in the parlour while Margaret poured the tea herself. The housemaid was occupied with the laundry and she did not call for her, and Copperfield laid out the papers on the low table with the neat professionalism of someone who understands that the arrangement of documents is itself a form of communication. He explained the situation clearly and without condescension, which she respected. He was a careful man and he delivered what he had to deliver in a way that acknowledged she was a capable person, while also, she noticed, assuming that she was hearing it for the first time. He described the original 1883 will's provisions for her, the surface property and trust for her lifetime use, the mill trust income as the primary income source, the surface estate passing to Edmund and Charles after her death. He described the 1887 codicil, which had created a separate trust for the mineral rights, with Wallace as trustee and Edmund and Charles as beneficiaries. He explained that this arrangement was intended to provide for the children separately, and was not intended to reduce her security, which was firmly established by the surface estate and the mill income. He handed her the codicil. She read it. She read it carefully and without rushing, which required a deliberate effort because she had already read it in April of 1889 and every word was familiar. She read it at the pace of someone encountering it for the first time because she could not read it at the pace of someone who had already memorized it, without revealing what she already knew. When she finished, she set it down on the table and asked one question. Had the codicil been filed at the county recorder's office, and on what date? Copperfield said it had been filed on October 14, 1887. She said she would need a few days to review the documents with her own counsel before she could respond. Wallace looked at her with the expression of a man who had not expected this response. Copperfield's expression did not change, which he thought was the more telling reaction. He was the experienced one, and the experienced attorney did not show surprise when a widow asked to consult her own counsel, because the experienced attorney had encountered widows who consulted their own counsel before. They left. The carriage went down the hill toward the river road, and she watched it from the parlour window until it disappeared among the bare trees. The snow that had been threatening all morning had not yet arrived. The light was flat and grey, and even on the hillside, the river would not be visible from the landing today. The light was wrong for it. She went to the writing table. She unlocked the lower drawer. She removed the grey notebook. She removed the household ledger. She removed the copy of the 1883 will she had obtained from the courthouse. She removed the geological survey from May of 1880. She removed the deed transfer from 1882. She removed the letter from the Consolidated Coal and Coke Company that had arrived in February of 1891, 9 months before Josiah died, offering to open negotiations for a lease of the subsurface mineral rights. She laid all of it on the writing table and she read through it, one document at a time in chronological order: the survey, the deed transfer, the equity trust instrument from 1879 that described the trust's terms, including the consent provision, the 1883 will, the coal company letter, the notes she had made about the October 1887 visit to Copperfield. Then she read the codicil that Copperfield had left with her. She held two things in her mind simultaneously: the codicil's language severing the mineral rights and the equity trust's consent provision. Between them was the 1882 deed transfer, and whether that transfer had brought the mineral interests within the trust coverage was a question she could not answer herself, but which she thought Whitfield might be able to answer. She went to Whitfield the following morning. Whitfield had offices on Federal Street in Youghiogheny City, in a building above a pharmacy that smelled, when you climbed the stairs, of camphor and dried paper. He was a small man with thin spectacles and the kind of deliberate manner that inspires confidence, not through certainty, but through thoroughness. He had handled her mother's estate in 1879 and had managed the equity trust since then, reviewing its terms each year when the annual statement came through and noting any changes in the trust composition. He was not a brilliant attorney. He would have been the first to say so, but he was careful, which had always seemed to her more valuable in an attorney than brilliance. She laid everything on his desk. She told him what she knew and what she suspected. She showed him each document in the order she had arranged them: the survey, the deed transfer, the trust instrument, the coal company letter, the codicil. She explained the marginal note she'd made in October of 1887 and what had occasioned it. He read everything without speaking. He asked occasional questions. He read certain passages again. He went to his bookshelves twice to pull volumes and consult references. Margaret sat in the chair across the desk and watched the light move across the floor from the single window while he worked. It was a cold morning, and the pharmacy smell came up through the floorboards when the heat in the stove sent the air moving. After an hour and a half, Whitfield removed his spectacles and cleaned them with the corner of his handkerchief. A habit she had observed meant he was coming to a conclusion, and he said he thought there were two possible arguments, either of which might have merit, and which together constituted a position worth defending. The first argument concerned the Equity Trust consent provision. The trust had been established in 1879 to hold Margaret's separate property, her inheritance from her mother, beyond the reach of Josiah's creditors or other obligations. The trust instrument's consent provision required her agreement for the disposition of any asset held within the trust. The 1882 deed transfer had moved a portion of the riverfront property into the trust, using language that was, in Whitfield's reading, potentially broad enough to include the associated mineral interests, particularly because the geological survey identifying those interests as potentially significant had already been filed by the time of the transfer. If the mineral interests were within the trust, then the 1887 codicil's attempt to sever them without her consent might be challengeable as a violation of the trust instrument. The second argument was narrower. The coal company's letter of February 1891 had opened lease negotiations for the mineral rights. Those negotiations had been ongoing at the time of Josiah's death in November of that year. An argument could be constructed, he was not certain it would prevail, but it was defensible, that the ongoing negotiations had created a partial commitment of the mineral rights to a specific use, and that this commitment predated the codicil's distribution provisions and should therefore be accounted for in the estate's overall settlement. He said he could not guarantee either argument would succeed. He said he would need to examine the county recorder's files to verify how the 1882 deed transfer had been indexed and what its coverage was understood to be at the time of recording. He said she should not discuss this with Wallace or Copperfield while the examination was underway. She said she had no intention of doing so. She left his office and went home by the Ferry Street crossing, which was longer than the bridge route but which gave her more time to think. The river was grey and high with the December melt. She walked along it for a few minutes before turning toward home, watching the current, thinking about coverage and consent and what it meant for something to be within a trust. The examination took from January to April of 1892. Whitfield visited the recorder's office 3 times and corresponded with 2 other attorneys whose practice included estate and trust law. During those months, the household continued in the ordinary way of households that are adjusting to a changed composition. 1 fewer person at the table, 1 fewer voice in the evening rooms, the servants attentive in the particular attentive way of servants, who are not sure yet whether the household will continue as it is. Margaret continued the accounts. The quarterly mill trust statement arrived in January, and she reviewed it and filed it. She received Wallace when he came in February to discuss the estate's administration, and she served him tea and answered his questions about the household's maintenance costs, and did not mention Whitfield. Whitfield's letter arrived on a cold April morning with late snow on the ground. The 1882 deed transfer, he had determined, had been indexed under a provision that, on careful reading, could be understood to include associated mineral rights in the conveyance. The original equity trust instrument's consent requirement was sufficiently broad, in his opinion, to cover those interests. This was not a certainty. The opposing argument existed and was not without merit, but in his view, the argument for Margaret's position was the stronger one. He recommended proceeding with a formal correspondence to Copperfield. She authorised him to proceed. The negotiations that followed lasted 5 months. Copperfield and Wallace engaged their own additional attorney at the second meeting, a sign she took as confirmation that they were taking the matter seriously. She received Wallace at the house twice more during those months. She continued to be pleasant and unhurried. She asked after his family. She did not discuss the proceedings. The settlement was reached in September of 1892. It gave her a life interest in 50% of the income from any future mineral lease on the Harlow property. The trust for Edmund and Charles remained. Wallace continued as trustee. But Margaret's share was documented in a supplementary instrument that both attorneys approved and that was filed at the County Recorder's Office in November of 1892. She read the supplementary instrument when Whitfield sent it to her. She read it twice. She filed it in the lower drawer, in the miscellaneous section behind the Coal Company letter. The Consolidated Coal and Coke Company's lease was finalised in 1894 after extended negotiations in which she was represented by Whitfield and in which she read every draft and noted every change. The mining operation commenced the following spring. The income began arriving in the quarterly statements the year after that, as reliable as the autumn view of the river from the landing window, as reliable as the household accounts that she continued to keep with the same attention she had always given them. Edmund and Charles did well. Wallace administered the trust with competence, now that its terms had been unmistakably clarified. The relationship between them settled into the formal civility of people who have been through a legal proceeding together and have agreed, without saying so, to proceed as if they have not. She stayed in the house above the Youghiogheny until 1907. She moved to Pittsburgh to be near Edmund's family, a decision she made in the quiet way she made all decisions, without announcing it far in advance or discussing it at length. She packed the household with the systematic attention she gave to all packing. The lower drawer she packed herself, transferring the contents to a cedar box she had lined with felt from the sewing room. She carried the cedar box when the movers came. She did not hand it to anyone. In Edmund's house in Pittsburgh she was given a sitting room with a window that faced east toward the river districts and the smoke of the mills. She set up her writing table in the corner. She put the cedar box on the shelf above it. She kept her accounts in the same format she had always used. The quarterly statements arrived and she reviewed them. The coal operations were still producing, though the seam was thinning now in its 9th year. She died in Pittsburgh in 1914, at the age of 73. The cedar box was on the shelf when Edmund found it. He opened it carefully, as one opens a box belonging to a person who was careful about what they kept. He found the grey notebook. He found the geological survey from May of 1880. He found the Coal Company letter from February of 1891. He found the 1882 deed transfer and the equity trust instrument from 1879 and the settlement document from 1892. He read the grey notebook from the beginning. He had not known, until that afternoon in his mother's sitting room with the east light coming through the window, that she had been to see the survey report in May of 1880 and had made a note of what it suggested. He had not known about the October 1887 notation regarding Josiah's visit to Copperfield. He had not known that she had read the Codicil in April of 1889, 2.5 years before his father died, and had understood its potential implications and made a marginal note about the 1882 deed transfer. He had assumed, in the way that people assume things about capable parents, that she had simply understood her situation when it presented itself and had addressed it as necessary. He sat in the chair by the east window for a long time. What he understood, reading the notebook, was that the legal outcome had not arisen from the situation. The legal outcome had arisen from 31 years of a woman paying attention to a house and a property and a set of documents in a lower drawer, building, without intending to build, simply by continuing to do what she had always done, the exact record that would be needed when the moment came. The moment had come. The record had been there. The coal seam beneath the eastern hillside of the Harlow property was largely exhausted by 1905. The mining company scaled back its operations and eventually surrendered its lease in 1907. The income had flowed for 11 years. What it had meant in practical terms was the difference between a widow who managed carefully and a widow who managed comfortably, and the difference between an estate that was settled as it had been arranged in 1887 and an estate that was settled as it should have been arranged in 1887 if the woman who lived in the house had been consulted. Some fortunes are made in a generation, some are kept in a drawer, and some are found again decades later, in the handwriting of a woman who understood, before anyone thought to ask her, that knowing what was there was its own kind of wealth, and that wealth, carefully tended, has a way of outlasting the assumptions that were made about it. There is something worth considering, in the long pauses between the events of this story, about what it means to keep records for a reason you cannot yet name. Margaret Harlow had no specific legal strategy in mind when she noted the Geological Survey in May of 1880. She had no suspicion of a codicil when she noted Josiah's October 1887 visit to Copperfield. She had no particular concern about the 1882 deed transfer when she filed it in the lower drawer. Each of these acts was simply the natural continuation of a practice, the practice of keeping track of what was happening in the affairs of her household and her property, that she had been performing since the first year of her marriage without any particular emergency in view. This is perhaps the most instructive aspect of her case, that the usefulness of the records was not predictable at the time of their creation. The lower drawer did not contain a coherent legal strategy. It contained a coherent account of things that had happened, maintained by a woman who had decided at some point early in her marriage that keeping such an account was worth doing. The legal strategy emerged from the account. The account did not emerge from the legal strategy. Whitfield had recognised this when she spread the contents of the lower drawer across his desk in January of 1892. He had been a probate attorney for long enough to know the difference between documents assembled for a proceeding and documents that had simply been there, in order, waiting. The former always showed the marks of selection, the choice of what to include and what to omit that shapes a document toward a conclusion. The latter were simply complete, containing the things that had seemed worth keeping at the time they were kept, before any conclusion had been determined. The coal company's lease of 1894 was negotiated over 11 months. Margaret attended several of the negotiation sessions herself at Whitfield's invitation, sitting in the corner of his office with her notebook and her cup of tea, while the attorneys discussed the lease terms. She did not speak at these sessions. She was not there to speak. She was there because she had spent 14 years accumulating the knowledge of the property that underlay the lease, and because Whitfield had found, in their months of working together, that having her present when complex decisions were being made produced better outcomes than consulting her separately afterward. She had opinions about the mineral rights, informed by 14 years of reading the geological surveys and the coal industry reports that came through the Pittsburgh commercial papers and the quarterly statements of the coal companies whose performance she had been tracking since 1880. She did not express these opinions unsolicited. When Whitfield asked her, she gave them clearly and with the specific evidence that supported them. When he did not ask, she wrote them in her notebook. The notebook accumulated, during those 11 months of negotiations, a detailed account of what was discussed and decided and deferred at each session. This was not the legal record. Whitfield kept that. This was Margaret's own record, in the grey notebook that was now in its 7th year, covering the years from the geological survey to the lease negotiations with the same steady handwriting, the same dated entries, the same careful abbreviations that she had developed over the years to make the notes compact without making them unclear. She had always been a fast writer. Her father had given her that. The surveyor's habit of writing quickly in the field, capturing what you observed before you moved on to the next observation. She had adapted it to her own work. The household account, the brief notation about Josiah's Pittsburgh visit, the full transcription of the codicil's provisions, the summary of each session with Whitfield and with the coal company's attorneys, fast and complete and dated, in the same grey notebook, available to anyone who needed to know what had happened and when. The coal miners arrived in the spring of 1895. They were serious men who came with equipment and a detailed plan for the first shaft and a timeline for the initial extraction that they reviewed with the coal company's operations manager in a meeting at the house. Margaret provided the tea and the dining room table, and the copies of the land plats they needed to confirm the shaft's placement. She did not attend the operations meeting. She did not need to attend. She had signed the documents that needed signing. Her part in this stage was done. She watched from the landing window as the first equipment was unloaded into the lower field. The morning was clear and cool, one of the April mornings that western Pennsylvania produces when the winter is finally over, and the air has the quality of something released from constraint. The river was visible through the newly leafed trees, the pewter colour it turned when the water was running high with snowmelt. She watched the equipment for a few minutes. Then she went back to her writing table and noted the date, April 12th, 1895. Mining operations commenced. First shaft placement confirmed by operations review. All instruments in order. She closed the notebook and put it in the lower drawer and went down to see about lunch. The income statements began arriving 6 months after operations commenced. They were detailed statements, organised by shaft and by extraction period, and by the formula established in the lease for dividing the royalty between the estate's surface rights and the mineral rights trust. She reviewed each statement against the lease terms before filing it. She had read the lease. She knew what the formula was supposed to produce. When the statements arrived, she confirmed that they produced it. Edmund reviewed the trust statements from the mineral rights side, the portion managed by Wallace. Margaret reviewed the lease royalty statements from the surface side, the portion managed by Whitfield's firm. Between them, the full financial picture of the mining operation was covered. They compared notes occasionally, by letter. Edmund had grown into a careful young man who managed his business affairs with the same steady attention his father had managed them, and he had come to respect his mother's understanding of the Harlow property's finances in the direct way of someone who has encountered that understanding in action and found it reliable. The mill trust had continued through all of this in its own steady rhythm. The quarterly statements, the reviews, the filings in the lower drawer. The tenant farmer had continued his seasonal agreements, the lower 40 acres producing reliably in good years and adequately in poor ones. The household accounts had continued as they always had. The lower drawer had grown thicker by degrees, with the accumulated paperwork of a property and an estate that were both more complex and more well documented than they had been in 1860. By the time she moved to Pittsburgh in 1907, the lower drawer held 47 years of household accounts. She did not bring all of it. She brought the legally significant materials, the equity trust instrument, the settlement document, the geological surveys and coal company correspondence, the mill trust instruments. And she left the older household invoices behind for Edmund to dispose of as he thought best. These distinctions, between what remained legally relevant and what had become merely historical, were clear to her. She had always known the difference between the document you kept because it might be needed, and the document you kept because it had already served its purpose and was now simply an artifact of things that had happened. The lower drawer had produced, when the moment came, exactly what was needed: the survey, the deed transfer, the trust instrument, the coal company letter, the codicils provisions in her own handwriting. These had been the documents that made Whitfield's arguments possible. Without them, the arguments could have been made in their general form, but not in their specific one, and it is the specific form that wins. The general argument that the equity trust consent provision might apply to the mineral rights was an argument any competent attorney could make. The specific argument that the 1882 deed transfer, on these specific terms, filed on this specific date, used language that brought those specific mineral interests within the trust's coverage that required the document. She had the document. She had always had the document. She had put it in the drawer in 1882, and the drawer had kept it until 1892 when it was needed, the way that a house keeps its inhabitants safe without actively intending to, simply by being solid and well maintained and there. Providence in November was a particular shade of grey. Not the cold grey of January, which was at least honest, but the undecided grey of a city that has not quite accepted that autumn is finished. The trees still holding a few brittle leaves, the air smelling of wet stone and chimney smoke and the river that ran below the hill. Eleanor Vane Whitmore walked in this city most mornings from November through March, along the same route she had walked since she'd moved to New Haven in 1874 and first understood that she required a daily circuit to think clearly. She walked from the house on Hillhouse Avenue down to the Green and along Chapel Street and back up through the college grounds, and she thought, on these walks, about whatever required thinking about: the household, the children, the trust statements when they arrived, the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the previous evening's correspondence. She had been born in Providence. Her father had a dry goods business on Westminster Street that had grown, through the years of the war and the textile expansion that followed it, into something more substantial than a dry goods business, though he had always continued to call it that out of the same stubbornness that makes New England businessmen resist adjusting their self-descriptions upward even when the evidence argues for it. He was a careful man. He kept his accounts in a large blue ledger that he reviewed each Thursday evening, and he had the practice, unusual for his time and class, of conducting these reviews with his 2 daughters present, giving them each a small notebook and a set of invented numbers and asking them to produce a summary account in the format he used for the business. Frances had found this an imposition. Eleanor had found it the most interesting hour of the week. There was something in the precision of accounting that matched something in her own disposition, the satisfaction of figures that balanced, the quiet discomfort of figures that did not, the way that the correct number, once found, settled the question completely and allowed you to move forward. She had carried this disposition through her schooling and into her adult life, and it shaped everything from the way she managed the household in New Haven to the way she read the trust statements that Storch sent each month after Cornelius's death. She had married Cornelius Whitmore at 21 in the summer of 1874, in a service at the First Congregational Church in Providence that her father had arranged with the usual New England combination of practicality and ceremony. Cornelius was 30, a manufacturer of industrial chemicals in New Haven, a serious man with large ambitions and a reasonable temperament, and the capacity, which Eleanor had identified early in their acquaintance, to be persuaded by a well-reasoned argument even when it contradicted his initial position. This was, in her view, the most valuable characteristic in a husband. She had spent 15 years putting it to occasional use. The household on Hill House Avenue was a comfortable one. Cornelius worked long hours and travelled frequently for the business, and in his absences Eleanor managed the house and their one surviving child, Adela, with the systematic attention she brought to everything. She had the household accounts on a weekly cycle, purchases reviewed and recorded on Friday evenings, the monthly budget reconciled on the last Sunday of each month, the quarterly statements from the business reviewed when they arrived. She paid the bills herself. She maintained the correspondence with the property agents who managed 2 rental houses in Providence that had come to her through her mother's estate. She understood in practical detail the financial circumstances of their life. Cornelius had drafted his will in 1882 with the help of an attorney in New Haven named Forrest, who had offices in the Tontine building and who was known in the city's commercial circles as reliable and careful. The will established a testamentary trust for Eleanor's benefit during her lifetime, funded by the bulk of the estate, with the remainder to pass to Adela after Eleanor's death. The trust income was to be managed by Cornelius's business partner, a man named Storch, who had been involved in the chemical manufacturing business since its founding, and whom Cornelius trusted in the complete way that people sometimes trust colleagues with whom they have shared the anxieties of building something from nothing. Eleanor had read the 1882 will when Cornelius showed it to her on the evening after it was executed. She had read it carefully, asked 3 specific questions about the trustee arrangement, and received answers that satisfied her. She had made notes. In September of 1885, Cornelius told her at supper that he had executed a codicil to the will. He was not secretive about it. He mentioned it in the same tone in which he mentioned other business matters, as information she should have rather than as something requiring discussion. He said it adjusted Storch's compensation as trustee and made a small change to the distribution schedule, moving trust income payments from quarterly to monthly intervals. He said it was very dry. She asked to read it. He said she was welcome to. He would get it from the study. But then Adela came down from upstairs with a question about her French lesson that couldn't wait, and then Cornelius had a letter to write before the evening post, and the codicil was not produced that evening. She reminded him twice in the following weeks. Both times something intervened. She began to think that this was less negligence than a mild reluctance on his part, not deception, but a husband's instinctive preference for managing his own affairs with a minimum of spousal review. She obtained the codicil herself 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning when Cornelius had gone to the laboratory, and Adela was at her drawing lesson, and the house was quiet. She found it in the centre drawer of the study desk, in the same folder as the 1882 will. She read it at the study desk in the good morning light from the east-facing window with the door closed. It contained what Cornelius had described. The compensation adjustment for Storch was straightforward. His annual fee as trustee would be fixed at a percentage of the trust's annual income rather than a flat rate, which was reasonable given that the estate's value was likely to grow. The payment schedule change from quarterly to monthly was, as Cornelius had said, a practical improvement. There was also a provision she had not been expecting, in the 3rd paragraph of the codicil's 2nd page, a clause stating that in the event of Eleanor's remarriage before Adela reached the age of 21, the trust income paid to Eleanor would be reduced by 1/3, with the withheld portion accruing to the trust principal until Adela's majority. She read this provision 3 times. She did not particularly object to it as a matter of principle. She had no plans to remarry. Cornelius had presumably drafted it as a protection for Adela's eventual inheritance, which was reasonable. What she objected to, quietly and without expressing it to anyone, was that she had not been told about it. It concerned her directly, and she had not been told. She also noticed in the margin annotation made by Forrest's hand that the codicil had been filed at the New Haven Probate Court on September 8, 1885. There was no annotation indicating a filing in Providence. She replaced the codicil in its folder. She replaced the folder in the centre drawer. She went to her writing table in the morning room, the small room off the parlour that was hers alone, where she kept her correspondence and her accounts, and she opened her notebook. The notation she made that September afternoon was one of the longest she had ever written in the notebook. It recorded the codicil's 3 provisions in full, the filing reference, and her observation about the single jurisdiction filing. It also recorded a question she had formed while reading the instruments. Was a single filing at the New Haven Probate Court sufficient for a codicil that affected the disposition of trust income derived from instruments rooted in the Providence Registry? The underlying trust held assets that included her mother's Providence properties and investments, which had been administered through the Providence Registry, and which remained subject to Rhode Island statutes as a matter of their original jurisdiction. She did not know the answer. She was not a lawyer, but she knew the question, and she knew that the question deserved an answer, and she filed the notation in her notebook and put the notebook away and returned to the management of her Tuesday. 4 years passed. They were 4 reasonably good years, the household steady, Adela growing, Cornelius busy, and sometimes preoccupied and always present in the particular way of a man who is working very hard. His health had begun to show the effects of that work by 1888. He was thinner than he had been, more easily tired, slower to recover from the colds that came each winter. Eleanor noticed and said nothing explicit and managed the household so that the demands on him at home were as light as she could make them. He died in February of 1889. A sudden thing, an apoplexy in the study at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday when Adela was at school and Eleanor was reviewing the household accounts in the morning room. She heard the sound, which was not a large sound but was a wrong sound, and she went to the study and found him in his chair, and she knew immediately what it was. The weeks that followed moved with the particular quality of weeks that follow a death, simultaneously very full and very hollow, the days dense with practical necessity and emptied of ordinary substance. The funeral, the letters, the visits, the arrangements. Adela, who was 14 and had loved her father with the complete trust of a child who's never had reason to doubt him, moved through those weeks in a grief that Eleanor could see but not quite reach. Storch arrived on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of February, 3 weeks after the funeral. He was accompanied by Forrest, Cornelius's attorney, and together they formed a unit of competence and good intention that Eleanor recognized as meaning. We are here to help you understand a situation that we expect you will find somewhat overwhelming. She had the tea ready. She poured it herself. She sat across from them in the parlour and she listened carefully while Forrest outlined the estate's structure, the will, the codicil, the trust, Storch's role as trustee, and she asked 3 questions when he finished, each of which was specific and factual, and which Forrest answered with evident respect for the quality of the questions. When they left, she went to the morning room. She took out her notebook. She read the September 1885 entry in full. Then she wrote the address of her Providence attorney, the elderly man who had administered her mother's estate in 1870 and who was, as far as she knew, still practicing, on a clean page, and she composed in her head the letter she would write to him. The letter went by post the following morning. She had phrased it with care. She asked him to make 2 inquiries at the Providence Registry. First, to examine the original instruments underlying the trust assets that had originated through her mother's estate, and to determine whether the current Storch accounting of those assets reflected their proper recorded value. Second, to determine whether any instrument related to the 1885 codicil had been filed in the Providence Registry, as opposed to the New Haven Probate Court. She then went to the monthly trust statement that Storch had sent with his letter of instructions. She read it in the systematic way she read all financial statements, column by column, category by category, comparing the figures to what she expected based on her understanding of the assets. The figure for what the statement called legacy instruments, the Providence-rooted assets from her mother's estate, was lower than she expected. Not dramatically lower, not so low that a casual reader would notice, but she was not a casual reader, and she knew approximately what those assets were worth because she had attended the shareholder meetings of her mother's textile company with her father until her marriage, and she'd continued to follow the company's published accounts in the years since, and the current figure in the trust statement was inconsistent with what she knew. She wrote this observation in her notebook, with the specific figures. The response from her Providence attorney arrived in April. He had made both inquiries and had findings that he preferred to discuss in person if possible. He could travel to New Haven, or she could come to Providence, whichever was convenient. She went to Providence on a Thursday morning in April, on the train from New Haven, arriving before noon. She had not been back to Providence since her father's death 2 years earlier, and the city had the slightly altered quality of all places one has known well and returns to after a grief, familiar in its bones but shifted in its surfaces, reminding one of things that have changed by presenting things that have not. Her attorney's office was on Benefit Street, above a printing establishment. He was smaller than she remembered, and his hair was entirely white, but his manner was the same. Deliberate, thorough, a man who did not rush toward conclusions because he had learned that conclusions reached too quickly often required revision. He had spread the relevant documents on his work table before she arrived. The Providence Textile Company shares, he told her, were recorded in the registry at a valuation that was substantially higher than what the Storch Trust statement showed. The difference was not minor. He had calculated it at approximately 12 to 15% below proper value, which over the period since Cornelius's death represented a meaningful difference in what the trust income should have been paying Eleanor. He could not say whether this was intentional. He thought it was more likely a clerical error in the accounting, the kind that arises when a trustee uses a stale valuation figure and does not update it against the registry records. But it was an error that needed correction, and the correction should be formal rather than informal. As for the codicil, there was no filing in the Providence registry. He had examined the registry records carefully, and there was no instrument associated with the Whitmore codicil of September 1885. The New Haven filing was on record. He had confirmed this through correspondence with the New Haven court, but Providence had nothing. He had then consulted the Rhode Island statutes on this point, and he had found a provision that addressed instruments affecting the disposition of income derived from trust property administered through the Providence registry. The provision was not extensively litigated. It was the kind of statute that existed more as a structural requirement than an actively enforced one. But it appeared to require that any such instrument be filed in duplicate, once at the testator's domicile jurisdiction, and once at the registry where the underlying property instruments were recorded. The New Haven filing was proper. The Providence filing had not been made. The consequence of this omission was, in his opinion, that the codicil's enforceability as it related to Providence-rooted assets was uncertain. Not void. He did not think he could say void, but subject to challenge on the grounds of incomplete filing. A court examining the question would have to determine whether the Rhode Island provision applied and whether the omission rendered the codicil's relevant provisions unenforceable against the Providence instruments. Eleanor listened to this analysis without speaking. When he finished, she asked one question. In his opinion, was the remarriage provision enforceable against the Providence Trust assets if the codicil had not been properly filed in Rhode Island? He said his opinion was that it was not clearly enforceable, and that a well-argued challenge would have reasonable prospects of success. She thanked him. She asked him to proceed on 2 fronts, to write to Storch and Forrest requesting a corrected accounting that reflected the proper valuation of the Providence instruments, and to file a precautionary notice at the Providence registry, stating that the trust assets originating there were held under the terms of the original 1882 will, since the 1885 codicil had not been properly filed in Rhode Island, and its application to those assets was therefore in question. He asked whether she intended to challenge the codicil directly. She said she had no current intention to challenge any validly executed instrument. She had no plans to remarry. The remarriage provision would not come into operation, but she believed in maintaining accurate records and clear legal positions, and the record should reflect what the Providence registry showed, which was that the codicil had not been filed there. He said he understood. He would proceed. The corrected accounting arrived from Storch's attorney 5 weeks later, after some correspondence that Eleanor followed through her Providence attorney's reports. The correction added to each subsequent monthly payment an amount that reflected the proper valuation of the Providence instruments. The cumulative difference between what Eleanor had received since February and what she should have received was paid as a lump adjustment in the autumn of 1889. Storch came to see her in person that December. He came alone, without Forrest, which she thought was significant. It meant the conversation was meant to be personal rather than legal. He sat in the parlour where she had always received him, and he spoke carefully, in the manner of a man who is trying to determine exactly what this woman understands and exactly what she intends. She served tea, she answered his questions directly. She confirmed that she had no current plans to remarry. She confirmed that the precautionary filing at the Providence Registry had been made by her attorney as a matter of record-keeping. She confirmed that she did not expect these matters to require further legal proceedings if the accounting was properly maintained going forward. He left. The accounting was properly maintained going forward. The precautionary notice remained filed at the Providence Registry throughout the period during which Eleanor received trust income. It was never tested in court. Eleanor never remarried. Adela reached 21 in 1896, and the trust continued under the same terms for Eleanor's benefit through the following decade. The monthly statements arrived and she reviewed them, and the figures were accurate, and she noted that they were accurate in her notebook, the same notebook in which she had made the September 1885 entry about the codicil's 3 provisions in the filing jurisdiction question. Adela married in 1899, a suitable match, a New Haven man of good family and reliable income, who moved into the Hill House Avenue house with them for 2 years before they found their own house on Crown Street. Adela was not a bookkeeping woman by temperament. She had her father's broader strokes rather than her mother's exactitude. But she had grown up in a household where the accounts were always current and the monthly statements were always reviewed, and she understood by osmosis, if not by explicit instruction, that this was what you did. Eleanor maintained her morning walks into her 60s. The route from Hill House Avenue to the Green and along Chapel Street and back through the college grounds had become so familiar that she could conduct it in any weather without thinking about it, which allowed her to think about other things. She thought, on those walks, about the trust statements, about the Providence instruments and their quarterly performance, which she still tracked in the notebook, about Adela and the grandchildren who had begun arriving in the early years of the new century. She did not often think about the September morning in 1885 when she had sat at the study desk and read the codicil and noticed that it had been filed in New Haven only. She had thought about it at the time, and then she had made her note and put the note away and waited. The waiting had been a long time. 4 years before the question became relevant, and another year before the investigation was complete. She had not known when she filed the note that she would wait 4 years to use it. She had simply filed it because it was accurate, and because accurate notes, in her experience, tended eventually to be worth having. Her father had taught her to produce a balanced account. She had been doing it ever since. The figures added up, or she found the error that explained why they did not. There was no mystery in it. There was only care and time and the quiet satisfaction of things that came out correctly. The morning walks continued until she was 68, when a winter icefall made them inadvisable for several months, and by the time the streets were clear again, the habit had shifted into something she did less regularly. She walked when the weather was good. She looked at the Providence Registry filings when the annual review was due. She kept the notebook on the writing table in the morning room, in its usual place, in easy reach. It was a plain notebook, dark blue cover, small. There was nothing remarkable about it. It sat on the writing table the way the inkwell sat and the letter opener sat, and the photograph of Adela at 9 years old sat, as one of the ordinary objects of a room that was organised and familiar and hers. It contained, if you opened it, the question she had asked herself in September of 1885, and the answer she had eventually obtained, and 30 years of monthly notes confirming that the figures were correct. Some trusts are well managed by their trustees, some are well managed by their beneficiaries. In the best cases, the beneficiary simply makes sure. Providence had a particular quality in November that Eleanor had always associated with the city's truest season. Not the summer, which was fine enough, and not the winter, which was simply cold, but November, when the city revealed its actual architecture and its actual colours with the leaves gone, when the hill above the river showed the specific pattern of its streets and the specific grey of its granite. She had grown up here. She carried its November inside her, the way people carry the weather of their childhood as a felt memory rather than an intellectual one. Her father's business had been in textiles, modestly, in a wholesale capacity that did not make him prominent but made him careful. He had taught his daughters the care that his work required. Thursday evenings in the study, the blue ledger open, Eleanor and Frances each with their own small notebooks and invented accounts to balance. Frances found it tedious. Eleanor found in it something that felt like the satisfaction of a puzzle that resolves itself when you have found the missing piece, and she'd been finding missing pieces in accounts and records for the rest of her life, with the same methodical pleasure that most people reserve for more obviously enjoyable pursuits. She had married Cornelius Whitmore at 21 and moved to New Haven and managed the Hill House Avenue household with the efficiency she brought to everything, which was the efficiency of a person who genuinely prefers things to be in order to things not being in order, rather than the efficiency of a person who feels they ought to prefer this. The difference matters. A person who genuinely prefers order will maintain it when no one is watching and no one will notice. Eleanor maintained her accounts on weeks when nothing was coming due and nothing was being reviewed by anyone else, and she maintained them the same way she maintained them during the quarterly reviews that Storch's office conducted, because the reviews were not what the accounts were for. The accounts were for accuracy, and accuracy was its own occasion. The September 1885 notation in her book, the Codicil's 3 provisions, the filing jurisdiction observation, the question about Rhode Island's duplicate filing requirements, had been written on a Saturday afternoon in the morning room with no one in the house. Adela was at her drawing lesson. Cornelius was at the laboratory. She had found the codicil herself in the study desk, read it herself, replaced it herself, and come to the morning room and written down what she had found. No one had asked her to. No one had known she had done it. It was simply what accuracy required. The 4 years between the notation and Cornelius's death in February of 1889 had been full years. Adela growing, the household steady, Cornelius working with the compressed intensity of a man who understands that what he is building has a limited season and intends to build as much of it as he can. His health had been declining by degrees in the final 2 years, and Eleanor had managed the household in a way that reduced his domestic obligations, without making the management visible to him, because she'd found that men of Cornelius's temperament sometimes resisted the kind of care that they could see being delivered more comfortably than the kind that was simply there. He died on a Wednesday morning in February in the study in his chair. Eleanor had heard the wrong sound and gone to him. She had been with him when he died. Afterward she had done what needed to be done with the efficient precision that was her natural response to situations that required it, which was to say that she did not delay and she did not become disordered. But the efficiency was not the absence of grief. It was, rather, the particular form that grief took in a person whose grief organizes itself around doing what needs doing. Storch and Forrest had come in the 3rd week of February. They had been civil and competent. Forrest had outlined the trust structure clearly. Eleanor had asked her questions. She had noted when she returned to the morning room after they left that the accounting they had promised to provide would need to be compared against what she knew the Providence assets were worth. The comparison, when the accounting arrived in June, produced the discrepancy she had expected. 15% is not a small difference. Over time it compounds. Over the 17 years that she would eventually receive trust income, 15% understated on the Providence instruments amounted to a substantial cumulative sum, the kind that made real differences to how a woman in her circumstances lived. Her Providence attorney's response to her inquiry had been prompt and thorough. He had been practicing since before Eleanor was born, and he approached her question about the Rhode Island statute with the care of a man who has learned that apparently small procedural questions sometimes have large consequences. The statute, he found, required duplicate filing. The duplicate filing had not been made. His opinion was that the point was arguable and worth arguing. She had authorized 2 corrections, the accounting and the precautionary notice at the Providence Registry. Both were made. Neither required litigation. Storch came to see her in December, and they had a conversation that was polite and slightly formal, and that ended with her confirming she had no plans to remarry, and him confirming that the accounting would be properly maintained going forward. It was. For 17 years the monthly statements arrived and she reviewed them, and they were accurate, and she noted that they were accurate and filed the statements in the cabinet in the morning room. Adela grew up and married and had children. The morning walks continued. The notation book remained in the drawer of the writing table in the morning room. She died in New Haven in 1921 at the age of 76. The last entry in the notation book was dated January 3, 1921. It recorded the December trust statement figures and noted they were consistent with the annual total she had calculated. Below the figures she had written, all in order, 3 words. They were the right 3 words, not because they summarized anything in particular, but because the whole purpose of the notebook, from the September afternoon in 1885 when she'd first made the note about the codicils filing, had been to be able to say them truthfully. All in order. The figures add up. Nothing is missing that ought to be there. Nothing is there that ought to be missing. The record reflects what was actually true. She had spent 40 years ensuring this was the case, and on the 3rd of January 1921, in the morning room on Hill House Avenue, she had confirmed one more time that it was. The morning room on Hill House Avenue was a small room off the parlour, facing east, with a window that caught the early light in a way that made it, from about 7 until about 10, the best lit room in the house. Eleanor had furnished it with her writing table and her files and 2 chairs, one for herself and one for whoever she might be speaking with in a professional capacity, and a tall bookcase that held the account books and the reference volumes she consulted most often. The cabinet where she kept the trust statements was against the east wall, close enough to the window that she could read the statements in the natural light without needing a lamp in the morning. She had established this room as her own in the first year of her marriage, and she had maintained it as her own through 15 years of marriage and through all the years after. Cornelius had understood that the morning room was her professional space in the way that his study was his, and he had not treated this understanding as unusual. He had been in this respect a husband who understood that the word wife did not preclude the existence of a serious mind with serious work to do. After his death, the morning room became, if anything, more central to her life rather than less. It was where she managed the trust correspondence. It was where she reviewed the monthly statements. It was where she kept the notation book and the files and the cabinet. It was where she sat in the early morning light and thought about the things that required thinking about, which after February of 1889 included, for several years, the questions about the trust's accuracy and the providence filing, and what these things meant for her actual financial position. She was not an anxious woman. Anxiety, in her experience, arose from not knowing things that could be known, and the way to resolve anxiety was therefore to find out the things that could be found out. The questions about the trust accounting were resolvable by obtaining the correct figures from the Providence Registry. The question about the codicils filing was resolvable by asking whether a filing existed. She asked. She obtained the figures. The anxiety, such as it was, resolved. What replaced the anxiety was not complacency, but a different kind of attention. The attention of someone who has verified that the current situation is accurate, and who intends to verify that it continues to be accurate on a regular schedule going forward. She had always reviewed the trust statements. She continued to review them, now with the added reference point of the Providence Registry's figures, which she asked her attorney to obtain for her every 2 years as a matter of routine. The attorney who succeeded her first Providence attorney in 1904 was his son, who had studied law partly to continue his father's practice, and partly because he had grown up hearing about the Whitmore Trust matter, and had found in it, from a young age, an example of the kind of legal work he wanted to do, the work of maintaining accuracy over time rather than the work of resolving crises that accurate maintenance would have prevented. He had told Eleanor this when he introduced himself after his father's death, and she had found it an appropriate thing for a young attorney to aspire to. She had told him that accurate maintenance was, in her experience, the most useful service a professional could provide. Not dramatic, not lucrative in the way of contested proceedings, but continuously valuable in the way that things which prevent problems are always more valuable than things which solve them, even though the preventing is less visible and therefore less celebrated. He had agreed. He continued the biennial registry review without being asked to continue it after Eleanor's death in 1921, because he had understood from their conversations that the review was not a service he was providing to Eleanor specifically, but a practice he was maintaining because it was the right way to manage trust assets with registry-rooted components. He continued it for the benefit of Adela, who was now the trust's primary beneficiary and then for Adela's children when the trust eventually wound down in the ordinary way of trusts that have done what they were set up to do. Adela herself had grown into a competent and careful woman, not as systematically precise as her mother, but sufficiently attentive to have understood, from watching Eleanor, that the trust statements deserved to be read rather than filed unread. She read them. She asked questions when she had questions. She kept the current year's statements in the cabinet in the morning room, which she had taken over when Eleanor died, and which she had maintained in the same organisation, partly out of respect for her mother's system, and partly because the system worked and there was no reason to change what worked. The notation book had been in the drawer of the writing table in the morning room. Adela had found it there and had read it, over the course of a Saturday afternoon in the February after Eleanor's death, sitting in the chair by the east window in the good morning light that the room had always caught. She had read it from the September 1885 entry about the codicil to the January 3rd, 1921 entry that said all in order, and she had sat for a while afterward thinking about what she had read. She had known her mother as a composed and thorough woman, who managed her affairs with precision and without drama. She had known the trust statements were reviewed, and that the cabinet was organised, and that the morning room was her mother's professional space in a way that deserved to be respected. She had not known, until she read the notation book, that the composure had been built on a specific foundation, a specific afternoon in September 1885, when her mother had found a codicil in a desk drawer, read it carefully, noted its provisions and its filing reference, and asked a question about a Rhode Island statute that would not need answering for 4 years. 4 years. She had sat with a question for 4 years, maintaining it in a notebook, checking it against new information as new information arrived, waiting for the moment when it would be relevant to pursue it. She had not pursued it prematurely. She had not raised the question with Cornelius before his death, which would have required explaining what she had found and possibly created unnecessary conflict. She had simply kept the question in her notebook and continued managing the household and reviewing the accounts and doing what needed to be done till Cornelius died and the question became relevant and she took it to Providence. This, Adela thought, was a particular kind of patience. Not the passive patience of waiting without purpose, but the active patience of continuing to maintain a question in mind, while also continuing to do everything else that needed doing, holding the question lightly, not gripping it or worrying it or letting it dominate, simply knowing it was there and checking it periodically against developments until the time came to act on it. She had not known her mother was capable of this. She revised her understanding accordingly. She put the notation book back in the drawer of the writing table in the morning room, and she continued to review the monthly trust statements when they arrived, as her mother had done, and she noted in a small book of her own, not as elaborate as Eleanor's notation book, but a record nonetheless, when she had reviewed them and what they showed. The writing table stayed in the morning room on Hill House Avenue for another 20 years after Eleanor's death, until Adela herself moved to a smaller house in 1941 and arranged for the table to go to her older daughter, who put it in the morning room of her own house and kept her household accounts at it, in the way that had apparently been established over 3 generations as simply the right way to manage household accounts, at a writing table, in a morning room, with the east window providing the good early light. If you are still listening, and not yet drifting, please consider subscribing to the channel. New stories from the Gilded Age appear each week, and the next one will be here when you return. Sleep well, and come back when you are ready. There is a question worth holding, if you're still awake enough to hold it lightly, that runs beneath all of these cases like the river that ran below Margaret Harlow's window on the Youghiogheny. Not a dramatic question, a quiet one. The question is, what does it mean to keep a record? On its surface, it is a procedural thing, a practical matter of paperwork and filing systems, and the maintenance of ledgers in a systematic format. This is what record-keeping looks like from the outside, which is to say from the perspective of the county recorder's office or the probate court or the estate attorney's assistant who processes the documents. From this perspective, a record is simply a document in a file, maintained by someone as part of their professional or domestic obligations. But from the inside, from the perspective of the person who keeps the record, it is something else. It is an act of attention. It is the decision made repeatedly and consistently over time that what has happened is worth noting, that the thing that occurred today, this transaction, this conversation, this agreement, This arrival of a document in the post deserves to be written down and placed in a location where it can be found later. This decision is not always obvious. Most of what happens on most days does not need to be written down. The meal eaten this morning, the street walked this afternoon, the household conversation at supper, these things happen and they are experienced and they pass, and there is no particular reason to record them. The person who records everything produces not a record, but an archive, and an archive, like a house full of objects that have never been sorted, is ultimately as difficult to navigate as an absence. The skill is in the selection, not the dramatic selection of a legal strategist who knows what evidence is needed for a specific proceeding. That selection happens too late, and it is shaped too much by the specific proceeding to be useful for anything else. The skill is in the quieter, less targeted selection of a person who has developed, over time, a sense of what kinds of things tend to matter, and who records those kinds of things consistently and completely, even when the specific way they might matter is not yet visible. Margaret Harlow had this sense. She had it about geological surveys and deed transfers and coal company correspondence because she had been paying attention to the Harlow property for long enough to understand that subsurface mineral rights were the kind of thing that tended to matter. Eleanor Whitmore had it about codicil filing requirements and trust accounting figures because she had been paying attention to her financial situation for long enough to understand that the accuracy of filings and valuations was the kind of thing that tended to matter. Dorothea Frame had it about deeds because her father had taught her, early, that the paper that records an arrangement is what protects the arrangement. Harriet Goss had it about professional information of the sort that employers communicate in informal but significant conversations. Ruth Mosner had it about everything that happened in the estate's operation because she had been trained to believe that everything that happened in the estate's operation was worth recording. Each of these women had developed, through different paths, the same fundamental orientation, the sense that the world in which they were living was a world of documents, and that the documents mattered, and that the person who understood and maintained the relevant documents was the person who could navigate the world effectively when navigation was required. This orientation was not universal. Most people do not live with this degree of documentary awareness. Most people manage their affairs with a combination of memory and faith. Memory in the goodwill of the people around them, faith that the documents will be where they need them when they need them, faith that the systems will work correctly. This is not unreasonable. Most of the time, for most people, it is sufficient. But for women in the Gilded Age who lived in a legal environment that was slowly improving, but had not yet fully recognized their independent legal personhood, and who were surrounded by the estate attorneys and trustees and executors and business partners of the men who had managed the affairs they were now inheriting, the combination of memory and faith was less reliably sufficient. The men around them had different interests. The systems sometimes failed. The documents were sometimes incomplete. The faith was sometimes misplaced. The women who did well in these circumstances were the ones who had added something to memory and faith, who had added their own layer of documentation, their own independent record of what the documents said and where they were filed, and whether the accounts were accurate, who had, in short, paid attention and kept their own records. This is what you have been listening to in these first two cases. The next three will continue the same theme in slightly different registers. A name removed from a property deed, a governess who kept her professional records against the day she would need them, a housekeeper whose 30-year ledger sequence turned out to be the most reliable account of an estate's affairs in the county. All different situations, all the same underlying practice. Pay attention, write it down, keep it where it can be found. The fire in the parlour grate is still going. The room is warm. The lamp on the side table is bright enough to read by, though reading is not required. The stories are simply here, in the quiet, in the warmth, settling around you the way warmth does when you have been still long enough to feel it settling. Come further in. The night is long and there are 3 more cases still to tell, each one a different house in a different city, each one the story of a woman who kept a record and the record kept her. Dorothea Frame was 52 years old in the spring of 1886, and she had been a widow for 31 of those years, long enough that the condition had ceased to feel like anything other than her ordinary state, the way a scar ceases to feel like a wound and becomes simply part of the landscape of the body. She had married at 19 and lost her husband at 21 to a fever that swept through the textile district in the summer of 1854, and she had been managing her own affairs, in the complete and practical sense ever since. She lived in a rented house on Locust Street in Philadelphia. It was a good neighbourhood, not fashionable. The kind where professional men and their families and widows of moderate means coexisted without particular ceremony. The house had 4 rooms and a kitchen passage and a garden in the back where she grew tomatoes and herbs, with the serious attention of a woman who had always preferred useful beauty to ornamental beauty. She had 2 regular boarders, an accountant named Fenton who worked for a shipping firm, and a schoolteacher named Miss Waring, and their rents paid enough of her household expenses that her income from the Spruce Street property was largely free for saving. The Spruce Street property was the centre of her financial life. She and her brother Thomas had purchased it jointly in 1871 with the money their father had left them, $2,000 each, the proceeds of the sale of their father's dry goods inventory and his household furniture after his death that February. Their father had been the kind of man who had worked carefully and saved methodically, and produced, at the end of a modest commercial life, something to leave his children. Not a great deal, but something, and something was what both of them had started from. Dorothea had understood at the time of the purchase that a joint tenancy with right of survivorship was a particular kind of legal arrangement. Her father had explained property law to her at various points in her childhood and young widowhood, in the same matter-of-fact way that he had explained everything, not as a special lesson for women who needed protection, but as information that any intelligent person managing their own affairs ought to have. He had told her, if you hold property jointly with someone, you hold it together, and if one of you dies, the survivor holds it outright. Neither of you can sell or transfer it without the other's consent. The paper that records this arrangement is what protects you. She had understood. The deed had been properly drafted and signed and witnessed and filed at the county recorder's office on the day of purchase, the 8th of April, 1871. She had her own copy, made by the notary who handled the transaction, stamped and dated. She had kept it in a cedar box in her bedroom on Locust Street from the day she brought it home, in company with the other documents she considered important. Her marriage certificate, which was historical rather than active but which she kept. Her husband's death certificate, the letter from her father's attorney relating to the estate settlement, and several years of tenancy agreements for the Spruce Street rental income. Thomas was a different kind of person than Dorothea. He was 4 years younger, more active, more easily drawn into new ventures, and somewhat less reliable in the management of paperwork than she was. He had an expansive personality and a commercial instinct that had served him well in some years and less well in others. In 1873 he had married Cecilia, who was organised and capable, and who ran their household on Walnut Street with complete authority. Cecilia was not hostile to Dorothea. She was merely precise about the boundaries of her domain, and those boundaries did not include cordial intimacy with a sister-in-law who had an independent income and no need of Cecilia's assistance. For 12 years after the purchase, the Spruce Street property was managed without significant friction. Thomas collected the rents and managed the tenant relationships, and dealt with the contractors when repairs were needed. Dorothea kept the accounts, a divided-page ledger that recorded rent receipts, repair costs, insurance premiums, and the quarterly net income that she and Thomas split evenly. She sent Thomas his half by bank draft on the 1st of April and the 1st of October, without fail. He occasionally thanked her, and occasionally did not. The property was profitable, and neither of them had any reason to revisit the arrangements. In 1883 the trouble began in its earliest form, which was simply a conversation over supper at Thomas's house on Walnut Street, to which Dorothea had been invited for Sunday dinner, as she was once or twice a year. Thomas had heard from a developer. He mentioned him as an acquaintance, someone he had encountered at a business dinner, who was interested in the Spruce Street area. The block was considered promising for residential expansion. The developer was prepared to offer a price for the frame property and several adjacent buildings that Thomas described as substantial. Dorothea asked to see the offer in writing. Thomas said he didn't have it in writing yet. It was a preliminary conversation. She asked about the developer's identity and his other projects in the city. Thomas told her his name. She recognised it. She had seen it in connection with a property development in Kensington that had produced less than its promoters had suggested. She noted this. She also noted in the margin of her account book the following week that Thomas had recently become a small investor in a development company that bore a name similar to the developer he had mentioned. She had seen this in the notices of a business incorporation filing in the Philadelphia Inquirer 3 months earlier, and had made a note of it at the time without knowing why it might be relevant. She now thought she knew. If Thomas sold the Spruce Street property to a developer in whose company he had an investment interest, the sale was not a simple arm's-length transaction. It was a transaction in which one party on the selling side had a financial stake in the buying side. This was not in itself illegal, but it was the kind of thing that a co-owner of the property being sold was entitled to know about, and Thomas had not mentioned it. When the formal offer arrived in writing the following month, she read it carefully and sent it to Miss Forsyth. Miss Forsyth practised on Spruce Street herself, 2 blocks from the property under discussion, which Dorothea had always thought was a particularly apt coincidence. She had retained Miss Forsyth in 1878 for a matter relating to her boarder's tenancy agreements, and had found her to be precisely what a woman in her position required in an attorney: rigorous, efficient, and entirely without condescension. Miss Forsyth had been admitted to the Pennsylvania bar in 1876 as one of the first women to practice there, a fact she mentioned in her professional correspondence exactly once, in the letter that introduced herself, and never again. Miss Forsyth reviewed the offer and wrote back with 4 observations. The price was reasonable but not exceptional for the current market. The developer's interest in Thomas's investment company was a conflict that should be disclosed formally to Dorothea as co-owner. The offer's terms contained a provision that would release the developer from certain warranty obligations if the property's sub-basement showed any evidence of water infiltration, a provision she found unusual and which suggested the developer had reason to know something about the property's drainage characteristics that he had not shared with the sellers. And the timing of the offer coincided with a rezoning proposal before the City Council that would, if approved, increase the permitted building height on the block, substantially increasing the property's development value. Dorothea read this letter twice. Then she wrote to Thomas and said she'd reviewed the offer with counsel and was not prepared to proceed at the current terms, and that she would like to have a further discussion when he had the opportunity. Thomas was frustrated. He came to Locust Street on a Saturday afternoon in a mood that was not quite anger, but was in the vicinity of it, the mood of a man who believes that a reasonable proposition has been unreasonably declined. They had a long conversation in the front parlour while Dorothea's boarders were out. Thomas made several arguments. The price was fair. The developer was known to him personally and could be trusted. The timing was right. The property was not going to become more valuable on its own. Dorothea said she wanted the conflict of interest disclosed formally, the water infiltration question investigated, and the offer price reviewed after the rezoning decision was known. Thomas said she was being obstinate. She said she was being careful, which was what co-owners of jointly held property were entitled to be. He left without resolution. The offer expired. The developer moved to other properties. 2 years passed. Thomas's financial circumstances became more constrained in 1884 and 1885, the result of several business ventures that did not produce what he had expected them to produce. He did not discuss this with Dorothea directly. She knew about it from the pattern of his behaviour, the longer intervals between his letters, the fewer social engagements he mentioned, the fact that Cecilia had reduced her household staff, which she had learned from a mutual acquaintance. She kept her own accounts as she always did, and deposited his half of the Spruce Street income into the account she maintained for that purpose, from which she sent his bank draft on the usual schedule. In the autumn of 1885, without telling her, Thomas went to the county recorder's office. What he produced there was a deed that listed the owner of the Spruce Street property as Thomas Frame, sole owner in a fee simple. He had engaged for this purpose an attorney she did not know, a man named Creighton who had offices in the financial district and who was, as she would later learn, known among certain practitioners for a willingness to file instruments without examining the underlying record with excessive care. The deed was accepted by a clerk at the recorder's office who, when later examined on the matter, could not clearly explain how he had processed an instrument conveying sole title to a property that the record showed as jointly held without verifying the co-owner's consent. The best reconstruction of what had happened was that Thomas had described the original joint tenancy as a clerical error on the original deed, an error that the new deed was correcting, and the clerk had not compared the new instrument to the recorded original. The original deed, the one from April of 1871, was still in the record books. It had not been altered. It said exactly what it had always said. Thomas Frame and Dorothea Frame, joint tenants with right of survivorship. Dorothea did not learn of the new deed for 5 months. She learned of it in March of 1886 on a Thursday morning, when Thomas came to her house on Locust Street with a real estate agent, and the news that he had accepted an offer on the Spruce Street property from a developer. This one different from the 1883 offer, a larger firm with more capital, and the offer terms were stronger than the previous one had been. The sale would close in 60 days. She asked to see the deed under which he was proposing to sell. He produced it. She read it. Her name was not on it. She sat with this for a moment. Not the long, destabilizing moment that Thomas perhaps expected, but the brief, efficient moment of a woman assessing new information and placing it in context. Then she said she would need to speak with Miss Forsyth. She went home. She went to the cedar box in her bedroom. She took out the 1871 deed. She sat at the writing table in her bedroom and held the two things she knew simultaneously. The 1885 deed in Thomas's possession, which bore his name alone. The 1871 deed in her cedar box, which bore both their names, stamped by the notary, filed in the county record, still the operative instrument regardless of what a subsequent clerk had processed without adequate review. She went to Miss Forsyth the following morning. Miss Forsyth read the 1871 deed. She asked Dorothea to describe the 1885 deed in detail, its format, its execution clause, its notarization, its recording notation. She listened without writing anything down. Then she went to her bookshelves and pulled 2 volumes and read in each for a few minutes. Then she put them back and she said, "The 1885 deed was not properly executed for the purpose of conveying title to jointly held property. Under Pennsylvania law, a joint tenancy could not be dissolved and title transferred to a sole owner by one party's unilateral action. Either both parties had to sign a conveyance, or a court order had to extinguish one party's interest. Neither had occurred here. The clerk at the recorder's office had made an error. The 1885 deed was, as a legal matter, void or voidable as a conveyance of Dorothea's interest. She was not yet prepared to say which, and the 1871 deed remained the operative instrument. She would write to Thomas's attorney. She would also write to the recorder's office. The letter to Thomas's attorney went out the following Monday. Its tone was, by all accounts, precise. It identified the joint tenancy of 1871, the improperly processed 1885 deed, and the legal requirements for dissolving a joint tenancy under Pennsylvania property law. It invited Thomas's attorney to explain how the 1885 instrument had been executed and filed without Dorothea's knowledge or signature. Thomas's attorney wrote back in a manner that suggested he had not been aware of the full circumstances when he reviewed the 1885 deed, that he had taken Thomas's word for the background of the title, and had not verified the chain of title against the recorder's records. He was, reading between the lines of his letter, professionally embarrassed. The attorney who had actually prepared the 1885 deed, Creighton, was not professionally embarrassed so much as professionally unavailable. He replied to none of the correspondence and was, within 2 years, no longer practicing in Philadelphia. The recorder's office conducted an examination of the file. This took 11 weeks. Their finding was formal and explicit. The 1885 deed had been improperly processed. The original filing from April 1871 remained the valid instrument. A notation was added to the record indicating that the 1885 deed should be treated as having been issued in error and as void from its inception. The joint tenancy of 1871 was confirmed. Thomas's developer was informed that the sale could not proceed as proposed. Thomas was, by this point, not speaking to Dorothea directly. All communication between them passed through Miss Forsyth and Thomas's attorney. The atmosphere was not warm. The resolution came in the form of a partition agreement negotiated between the 2 attorneys over the course of 6 months. A joint tenancy with right of survivorship could be partitioned, by mutual agreement, into separate undivided interests, each party holding 50% individually rather than jointly, which meant each could sell or transfer their individual interest without the other's consent. Thomas could sell his half to the developer if he chose. Dorothea could retain her half or sell it separately as she judged best. Thomas sold his half. The developer incorporated it into a larger acquisition and built a residential block on the combined property. Thomas received his price, which was, in the end, somewhat better than the 1883 offer would have been. The rezoning that Miss Forsyth had anticipated in 1883 had indeed been approved in 1884, increasing the permitted height and therefore the development value. Dorothea retained her half-interest in the property. The developer, having acquired Thomas's share, now had a co-owner in Dorothea, a co-owner he had not expected, and who was, he quickly understood, not going to be hurried or pressured. She received her half of the rental income from the existing tenants, while the developer made his plans for the larger development. She reviewed the income statements with her usual care. When the developer eventually made an offer to purchase her remaining interest, she considered it carefully and declined the first two offers and accepted the third. The sale of her half-interest was completed in 1903. The price was, by that point, reflecting both the improved neighbourhood and 17 years of careful maintenance of her legal position. She put the proceeds into investment accounts that she managed through a trust at the Philadelphia Savings Institution, and lived on the income in the house on Pine Street that she purchased outright with a portion of the sale funds. It was a house similar to the one on Locust Street. 4 rooms, a garden, a south-facing bedroom window. She set up the cedar box on the shelf in the bedroom, in the same position it had occupied for 32 years. The 1871 deed was inside. It was historical now, superseded by the partition agreement and the eventual sale, but she kept it because it was the original. It was the document that said what had always been true about who owned what. Miss Forsyth retired from practice in 1908, after 32 years at the Philadelphia bar. She sent a note to each of her regular clients when she closed the practice. Dorothea wrote back with congratulations and a brief reflection on what working with her had meant. Not effusive, but specific. The 1886 matter had been the most clarifying legal experience of her life, she said, in the sense that it had shown her how much protection could be found in a correctly filed document when you knew where it was. She had known where the 1871 deed was because she had put it in the cedar box in 1871 and not moved it. This was not wisdom. It was simply the habit of a woman who had been managing her own affairs alone since she was 21 and had learned early in that managing that the document you needed was always the one you had filed properly the first time. The cedar box sat on the shelf in the Pine Street bedroom until Dorothea died in 1911. She was 67 years old. She had been a widow for 46 of those years. The inventory of her estate, prepared by the executor she had named in her will, included the cedar box as a personal effect, noted as containing historical property documents. The inventory did not attempt to describe what those documents had been worth when the time came to need them. Some values are only legible in retrospect. Some are legible only to the person who knew, from the beginning, where the paper was. Philadelphia in spring had the quality of a city that has been waiting. The winters were neither picturesque nor particularly severe, but they were sustained, and when they ended, the city emerged into April light with the specific pleasure of somewhere that has been deferred long enough. Dorothea Frame had walked Locust Street and Spruce Street, and the streets between them long enough to know the particular textures that announced the season. The flower stall on the corner that opened the same week every April, the pair of cats in the window of the notary's office across from the pharmacy, the way the elm trees on Walnut Street put out their leaves a full week before the oaks. She was a woman who noticed things. She'd been a widow for long enough that the noticing had lost any quality of loneliness and become simply a way of inhabiting the world fully, attending to what was around her, not as a substitute for attending to a person, but as a practice in its own right, the way that someone who has always cooked well continues cooking well, because the cooking itself is satisfying, rather than because there is anyone particular to cook for. The boarders on Locust Street were a steadying presence in the household without being a demanding one. Fenton, the accountant, arrived for his supper at 6:30 with the reliability of someone whose professional life ran on schedule and who extended that schedule into his personal habits as a matter of consistency. Miss Waring, the schoolteacher, arrived somewhat less predictably, depending on what had happened at the school that day. But she was pleasant company when she was present and undemanding when she was not. Dorothea managed the house around both of them, with the ease of someone who has been managing shared accommodations long enough to have internalized the rhythms. The Spruce Street property was 4 blocks north and 2 blocks east of the Locust Street house, which meant she passed it regularly on her way to and from the market and the library and the various other errands that composed the working infrastructure of a woman's week. She sometimes paused in front of it and looked at the facade, the same solid brick row house she and Thomas had purchased in 1871, maintained through the years by the tenants and by the contractors Thomas engaged for the larger repairs. She noted its condition the way she noted many things, straightforwardly, without sentiment, as a record of what was currently true. After the 1886 events, she paused in front of it less often. Not because the outcome had been unsatisfactory. The outcome had been exactly what the outcome should have been. But because the events had changed the character of her relationship to the property in a way that made looking at it slightly more complex. It was still her property, or rather her 50% of it, and she still received her half of the rental income and still reviewed the accounts. But it was also now a place that had required her to demonstrate what she already knew was true, which was not a comfortable category of place. She had sent Miss Forsyth 3 clients over the years, the wife of a neighbour whose property question she could see needed someone thorough, a woman from her church who had an inheritance matter requiring a clear eye, and Miss Waring, the school teacher, who had a small bequest from an aunt that she wanted administered correctly. Miss Forsyth had handled each of these matters with the precision that Dorothea had come to expect. When Miss Forsyth retired in 1898, Dorothea wrote back to her note with congratulations and a specific observation. She said the 1886 matter had been the most clarifying legal experience of her life, in the sense that it had shown her how much protection was available in a correctly filed document when you knew where it was and had kept it properly. She had sold her half of the Spruce Street property in 1903, when she decided she had held it long enough and when the offer price reflected both the improved neighbourhood and 17 years of patient retention. She bought the Pine Street house with part of the proceeds, a house larger than the Locust Street one, and with a better garden, more sun, better soil, the south-facing wall where she grew tomatoes producing twice what the Locust Street wall had managed. The fig tree she had moved in a pot from Locust Street took 2 years to settle into the Pine Street soil before producing again, and then it produced steadily, the way things that have been properly established produce, not abundantly but reliably, and reliability was in her view more useful than abundance in almost every domain. The cedar box held fewer active documents by 1903 than it once had. The 1871 deed, a copy of the partition agreement, the recorder's office determination that the 1885 deed was void, a few early receipts from the property's first years. She had no operational need of any of these things. But she kept the 1871 deed because it was the original, and the original was the record of what had been true from the beginning, and what had been true from the beginning was that her name was on it. She thought sometimes about the clerk at the recorder's office, who had processed the 1885 deed without comparing it to the 1871 filing. She did not think about him with anger. She thought about him the way you think about a fact that has something instructive in it, that the system for verifying the accuracy of a filing had failed, and that the thing which had made the failure remediable was the document in the cedar box, which had not been filed in the recorder's office, and which had therefore been safe from whatever the recorder's office had processed. This was an interesting fact about where to keep important documents. The original copy, retained by the party who held the interest it documented, was in some ways more protected than the filed copy, which was subject to subsequent filings that a negligent or dishonest clerk might process without adequate verification. She had not known this in 1871 when she put the deed in the cedar box. She had simply put it there because the cedar box was where she kept important documents. But the consequence of that simple act was that when the filed copy was superseded by an improperly processed deed, the retained copy was available to demonstrate that the supersession was invalid. Keep the original. Keep your own copy. The filing system belongs to everyone who uses it. The cedar box belongs to you. She died in Philadelphia in 1911, at the age of 67. The cedar box was on the shelf in the Pine Street bedroom. The inventory of her estate noted it as containing historical property documents. The 1871 deed was found inside it, in excellent preservation, its notary's seal still distinct after 40 years. Her executor held it for a moment before filing it with the estate's papers. He had not known the story of the Spruce Street property, or the 1885 deed, or the recorder's examination. He had not known that the document in his hand had once been the only evidence that a name was on a title, when another document claimed it was not. He filed it with the estate's papers, The estate was settled. The Pine Street house was sold. The fig tree, which had been struggling in the Pine Street soil for 8 years, produced a modest crop the summer after Dorothea died. The new owners let it stand. It continued to produce for several years more, reliably and modestly, in the way of things that have been established in good soil long enough to persist beyond the particular attention of the person who planted them. The years between the 1886 proceedings and the 1903 sale were years of a particular kind of independence. Dorothea had always been independent in the practical sense, but there is a difference between the independence of a person who has not been tested and the independence of a person who has been tested and found that the test did not break them. After 1886, she was in the second category. She had been told her name was not on a deed. She had produced a document showing that her name was on the deed. The legal system had agreed with her document. She had continued to hold her property. This had happened, and she knew it had happened, and knowing it had happened made her independence feel more solid than it had felt before. Not less cautious, more solid. Caution and solidarity are not the same thing. She was, if anything, more careful in the years after 1886 about reading documents before signing them and about keeping copies of what she signed. She had always been careful in this respect, but the 1886 events had confirmed, in the specific and practical way that only an actual event can confirm, that the carefulness was warranted. The city around Spruce Street changed through those years in the way that Philadelphia neighborhoods change when they are close enough to the center to attract investment, but not so central as to be immediately consumed by it. New construction appeared on several blocks in the late 1880s and early 1890s. The adjacent properties that Thomas's developer had been interested in became part of a larger residential development. The Spruce Street block itself remained as it was. The row house, the tenants, the solid brick facade that Dorothea had noted unchanged since 1871. She received her half of the rental income reliably. She reviewed the accounts each quarter with the same attention she had given them since the beginning. The developer who had acquired Thomas's half would occasionally send a letter through attorneys suggesting they discuss the remaining half, and she would have Miss Forsyth's successor reply that she was not currently interested in selling, and the conversation would end there until the next time. She was not merely waiting, she was watching. She was watching the neighbourhood and the market and the pattern of what was being built and for whom, and at what prices, because these were the factors that would eventually determine the right moment to sell, and she intended to sell at the right moment rather than at a convenient one. The distinction mattered. Convenience was about reducing the friction of the transaction, while rightness was about getting the price that the property was actually worth at the point in time when its value was highest. Thomas had sold at a convenient moment. His financial circumstances had been strained and the offer had arrived and he had taken it. The price had been reasonable. The price she received in 1903 was substantially better, because 17 years had passed and the neighbourhood had settled into the kind of dense, well-serviced residential character that produced sustained demand, and the remaining half of the property had become more rather than less attractive to the developer who needed it to complete his block. She negotiated the sale herself, with her attorney present but not leading. She had, by 1903, been managing the Spruce Street properties affairs for 32 years, and she understood its value and its characteristics better than anyone she might hire to represent her. She knew the rental income and its trajectory. She knew the physical condition of the building and what maintenance it would require in the next decade. She knew the neighbourhood's development pattern and what the completion of the developer's block would mean for the surrounding property values. She presented this knowledge in the negotiations as simply what she knew, without drama, and the developer, who was a businesslike man, recognised knowledge when he encountered it, and adjusted his offer accordingly. The final price was, in the assessment of Miss Forsyth's successor who handled the conveyancing, an excellent outcome. He said so in his letter, accompanying the closing documents. Dorothea wrote back thanking him, and noting that the outcome reflected 32 years of consistent management of the property's affairs, which she thought was the appropriate attribution. She bought the Pine Street house in the same month the Spruce Street sale closed. She was deliberate about the timing. She'd identified the Pine Street house the previous year, had arranged conditional financing, and had been ready to move quickly when the Spruce Street sale was finalised. She did not like gaps between transactions of this kind. The money should go from the sale to the purchase without a protracted interval in which its location was uncertain. The moving took 3 days. She had organised the contents of the Locust Street house by category in the weeks before the movers came. Household goods, books, documents, the garden equipment, the fig tree in its pot, so that the move was a matter of loading categories in order and unloading them in order, each item going directly to its designated location in the new house, rather than being piled in rooms to be sorted later. She did not like piles. Things in piles were things that could not be found quickly, and things that could not be found quickly were functionally lost. The cedar box was the first thing she carried into the Pine Street house herself before the movers began. She put it on the shelf in the bedroom and then directed the rest of the move from there. The Pine Street house was hers in the complete sense that the Locust Street house had never been. She owned it outright, with no mortgage and no partner, not rented from a landlord but actually owned. The deed bearing her name and her name alone, recorded at the county office on the day of purchase. She read the deed when it came to her through the conveyancing. It said what it was supposed to say. She put it in the cedar box on the shelf in the bedroom. 2 deeds in the cedar box now. The 1871 one, historical and superseded but kept because it was the original. The 1903 one, current and operative, recording what was currently true about what she owned. The difference between the 2 deeds was the difference between what had once been true and what was now true, and both truths were worth keeping because both had informed the life she had built. The fig tree produced a modest crop in its second summer at Pine Street. Not abundant, the soil was still settling, the roots still establishing themselves in new ground, but steady, the way things are steady when they have been through a difficult transplant and survived it and begun, with some deliberateness, to take hold. She picked the figs in the late afternoon of a September day, standing in the garden in the particular warm light of September that falls at a low angle and makes everything it touches look considered. The figs were small and sweet. She ate some and brought the rest inside and put them in a bowl on the kitchen table, and thought that 32 years of management of a property she had never been able to enjoy particularly, because of what the management required, had produced in the end an afternoon in September in a garden that was hers in the complete sense, eating figs from a tree she had moved herself, in a house she had bought with the proceeds of that management. This was sufficient. It was, in fact, rather more than sufficient. It was exactly what patience produces when the patience is organised and purposeful, and continuously maintained. The exact outcome that was available, obtained at the exactly right time, with nothing wasted and nothing lost that did not need to be lost. The Spruce Street house was demolished in 1927, when the block was finally redeveloped completely, and the remaining 1870s row houses were removed to make way for a larger apartment building. The cedar box with the 1871 deed was in the Pine Street estate by then, and had been since 1911, and had been absorbed into the estate's historical papers when Dorothea's executor settled her affairs. The deed was preserved in the estate file at a Philadelphia law firm until 1952, when the firm closed and its historical files were donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The Historical Society catalogued the deed as a routine property instrument from the 1871 Spruce Street acquisition. Nothing in the catalogue entry noted its significance. The catalogue entry simply recorded what the deed said, which was what it had always said and had always been true. Thomas Frame and Dorothea Frame, joint tenants with right of survivorship, from the 8th day of April in the year 1871. Her name was there. It had always been there. It remained there still in the Historical Society's collection, in the very document that someone had once attempted to supersede by filing a different one without her knowledge or consent. The attempt had failed. The name had stayed. The Lakeshore Drive house in Chicago had a view of the water that changed so completely with the seasons that it was almost like looking out at different bodies of water. In summer, the lake was a solid blue-green, certain of itself, full of light. In autumn it became something more uncertain, darker and larger feeling, the horizon dissolving on overcast days until there was no clear line between water and sky. In winter it was sometimes frozen near the shore and sometimes not, the ice unpredictable, and the wind that came off it was the kind of wind that made itself known as a physical force, rather than a mere atmospheric condition. In spring it relaxed by degrees, the colour shifting through grey and blue and finally back to the summer certainty. Harriet Goss had watched this view change through 9 complete cycles before the winter of 1889. She had come to the Alderton household in October of 1878, when Clara was 7 and there was not yet a Thomas Jr. or a Beatrice. When the house was newer, and Thomas Sr. was 42 and vigorous and somewhat quicker to laugh than he would be by the end. She had been 23, and had come from a family in Springfield that was educated and comfortable but not wealthy, the kind of family that produced, in those years, women who taught school or became governesses or both at different stages of their lives, women who were generally more educated than their employers but less financially secure, which was a particular kind of position that required a particular kind of equilibrium to inhabit without bitterness. Hattie had equilibrium. It was perhaps the quality she had in most abundance, along with patience and a genuine affection for children that was not performative. She liked children in the direct, uncomplicated way that people like things they are genuinely interested in. She was interested in how they thought, in the specific quality of each child's intelligence, in the satisfaction of watching a mind find its footing with a new idea. She had found this interest early in her teaching of a Sunday school class in Springfield, and had pursued it deliberately into the professional work of a governess. Clara Alderton had been a quick, serious child who had taken her studies seriously from the beginning, and who had outgrown Hattie's instruction in some subjects, Latin especially, by the time she was 12. Thomas Jr., who arrived 3 years after Hattie, was a slower and more imaginative child, less interested in accuracy and more interested in the way ideas connected, which she had learned to work with by meeting him where his curiosity was and letting the structure come later. Beatrice, born in 1877, a year before Hattie's arrival, had been 4 when Hattie came to the house, and had spent the years of Hattie's tenure growing from a small, watchful child into a quietly fierce 10-year-old who read everything she could reach and asked questions that were sometimes inconvenient and always worth answering. The Alderton household was a good one to work in. Thomas Sr. was a businessman of the sort that Chicago produced in those years, absorbed in his affairs, frequently away, present in the household in the background way of men whose primary energies go elsewhere, but not unkind and not indifferent to the people under his roof. He came to the schoolroom occasionally to see what the children were studying. He asked Hattie's opinion on their progress with a genuine interest that she had not always encountered in employers. He treated her, in the household hierarchy, as something closer to a professional colleague in the management of his children's development than to a domestic servant, which was unusual enough that she had noticed it in her first month and valued it for all 9 years. She kept the employment journal from her first week. She had learned to keep it from her mother, who had advised her when she took her first governess position in Springfield. Write down what you are promised and what you are paid and what your duties are, and note any change in these things when it happens. People remember agreements differently when there is no record, and a record is always in your favour because you were the one who made it. The employment journal was not a large book. It was a plain cloth-covered notebook, the kind available from any stationer, which she bought new at the beginning of each year and dated on the front. She recorded her salary arrangements, any changes to her duties or schedule, observations about the children's progress that she might want to refer to later, and any significant conversations with her employer that related to her professional situation. These entries were brief and factual. She did not record her personal feelings about the family or the work. Those were her own and not relevant to the journal's purpose. The entry that would eventually matter was made on October 22, 1886. On that evening, Thomas Alderton had sat with Hattie in the library after the younger children were in bed, a custom that had developed in the second year of her tenure and had continued through the years since, a quiet hour of reading or occasional conversation while the house settled around them. Thomas read the newspapers. Hattie prepared the following day's lessons. Sometimes they talked. Often they did not. That particular evening, Thomas had set down the newspaper at about 8:30 and said without preamble that he had been reviewing his affairs with his attorney and wanted her to know that he had made provision for her in his will. He said he had thought about it carefully and had spoken with Hatch, his attorney in the Tontine building, and that a provision was in place that would ensure she was not left without resources if anything happened to him. He did not say what provision, he did not name a figure, he said he wanted her to know it was there so she could plan accordingly. Hattie said she appreciated knowing. She said it with the equanimity she brought to most things. She was 31 years old in 1886 and she'd been a governess for 8 years, and she was practical about her position. Governesses did not often receive bequests from the families they served, but it was not unheard of. She had read of such cases. She believed Thomas was sincere. She also knew, with the practical clarity that sustained her professional equilibrium, that sincerity and execution were different things, and that what she had was a conversation, not a document. She wrote it in the employment journal that evening when she returned to her room. October 22nd, 1886. Mr. A informs me during the library hour that he has made provision in his will for my future care. No specific terms disclosed. His manner was considered and clear. Mentioned Hatch as the attorney who has handled the arrangement. She dated the entry, closed the journal, and put it in the small leather case under her bed, where she kept the current year's journal and the previous 2 years' volumes. 3 years passed. They were full years, marked by the ordinary movements of a household with children in it. Clara going off to finishing school in 1887, Thomas Jr. departing for preparatory school in 1888, Beatrice remaining at home with Hattie until she too left for school in the autumn of 1889. In those 3 years, the household contracted around the departures of children and expanded briefly during the summers when they returned. Thomas Sr.'s health showed a gradual and not alarming decline from 1887 onward. He was thinner by degrees, sometimes winded on the stairs, more careful about what he ate. His physician had advised him to rest more and travel less. He rested more and travelled less. He died on a Wednesday morning in February of 1889, an apoplexy. Hattie was in the schoolroom with Beatrice, reviewing French irregular verbs, when she heard the particular quality of sound from below that meant something had gone wrong. The weeks that followed the death moved according to the established patterns of such weeks in the households of prosperous Chicago families. The funeral at St. James on Huron Street, the reception at the house, the visitors, the letters, the gradual withdrawal of sympathy calls and the installation of a new quiet in the rooms. Mrs. Alderton, who had always managed the household's social dimensions competently, now became its centre in a more complete way, the conduit through which all decisions about the family's future passed. She was a composed woman in her grief, self-contained in the way of women who have been managing things all their lives and know that things must continue to be managed. Mrs. Alderton's brother, a man named Greer from Milwaukee, arrived 5 days after the funeral. He was the kind of man who understood business and property and legal arrangements, and who arrived in a crisis with the confidence of someone who has been authorized to help. He was efficient and brisk and not unkind to Hattie, but he spoke to her in the compressed, slightly detached tone of a man who is not yet certain whether she will be part of the household's future and is therefore not investing in the relationship. He reviewed Thomas's affairs. The will was produced by Hatch at a reading in the last week of February. Hattie was not present. This was expected. It was not customary for household employees to attend the reading of a will unless they had a reason to believe they were named in it. She did not know yet whether she had a reason to believe this. Greer came to the schoolroom the following morning and informed her, standing in the doorway, that the will had been reviewed and that there did not appear to be any provision for her. He said it with the manner of someone delivering news they consider straightforward. He said the estate would provide a month's salary in recognition of her service, as was customary. Hattie said she would like to review the will herself, or at least to confirm with Hatch that there was no codicil or supplementary instrument that might relate to her. Greer said he was not sure that was appropriate. Hattie said, with the even tone she brought to all professional conversations, that she had reason to believe that Thomas Alderton had made provision for her, that he had told her so directly in October of 1886, and she thought it was worth confirming whether any such provision existed in the will's full record before proceeding on the assumption that it did not. Greer looked at her with the expression of a man who is re-evaluating a situation. He said the will had been drafted in 1884 and the codicils, if any, had not been presented to him. She asked him to ask Hatch whether there were codicils. He said he would do so. She went back to her room that evening. She did not allow herself to feel the thing she might have felt, the particular kind of uncertainty that comes when you have been told one thing by someone you trusted and are now being told something else by someone who has not earned that trust. Instead, she opened the leather case under her bed and took out the 1886 volume of the Employment Journal. She turned to October 22nd. She read the entry. Then she thought about what she knew. She knew that Thomas had told her he had made a provision in his will. She had believed him then, and she believed him still. She knew that the provision might take the form of a codicil, since the will itself had been drafted in 1884, 2 years before the October 1886 conversation. She knew that Greer had not been given codicils when Hatch presented the will, which might mean there were no codicils, or it might mean that the codicils existed and had not been included in what Hatch brought to the reading, perhaps by oversight or perhaps because no one had asked specifically for them. She wrote a letter to the probate court. She'd learned from the general practical education of a woman who has managed her own affairs independently since her early 20s that probate courts kept records, and that those records were public documents, and that any interested party could inquire of them. She did not know if she was an interested party in the legal sense, but she wrote the letter in the most specific terms she could manage: the estate of Thomas Alderton, Lakeshore Drive, Chicago, Cook County, admitted to probate in February of 1889, and she asked whether there were any codicils or supplementary testamentary instruments on file in connection with that estate. She sent the letter by post on a Thursday and waited. The clerk's reply arrived 12 days later. It was brief and official. There were 2 codicils on file for the estate of Thomas Alderton. The first, executed in 1885, related to the Educational Trust for Thomas Jr. The second, executed in November of 1887 and filed on the same date as the original will, named Harriet Ruth Goss as a legatee. She read this letter standing at the writing table in her room. Outside the window the lake was its February colour, grey-green, deeply uncertain, the ice gone from the shore that week. She sat down, she read the letter again. She noted that the codicil had been executed in November of 1887, 13 months after the October 1886 conversation in the library. He had done what he said he would do. He had told her about it, apparently, before he had done it, and then he had done it. She engaged an attorney, a woman, as it happened, one of the small number of women practicing in Chicago, recommended by a friend who knew the legal community there. Her name was Miss Cavendish, and she had been practicing for 4 years, and was not easily startled by unusual situations. Miss Cavendish wrote to Hatch. Her letter identified the codicil that the probate court had confirmed, asked for the full text of that instrument, and invited Hatch to explain how the codicil had been omitted from the materials presented to Greer at the estate reading. Hatch's response was prompt and candid. The codicil had been in the file and had been on the list of instruments to present at the reading, but had been inadvertently omitted from the packet he'd assembled. He was apologetic. He produced the full text of the codicil in his response. It named Harriet Ruth Goss as a legatee. It left her a sum of $3,000 from the estate to be paid within 1 year of the testator's death, in recognition of 9 years of faithful and excellent service to the Alderton household and to his 3 children. The language was Hatch's careful legal language, but the characterization was Thomas's, faithful and excellent. He had used those words deliberately. The negotiations about timing and estate liquidity took several months. There were other obligations on the estate, other distributions to be made, and the trust for Adela, Thomas's daughter by a previous arrangement, had its own schedule. But the bequest was never in dispute. Hatch confirmed its validity. Greer acknowledged the obligation with less comfort than he acknowledged the estate's other obligations, but with no actual challenge to the legal position. The payment was made in the autumn of 1889. $3,000 was 5 years of her salary, approximately at the rate Thomas had paid her in her final years. It was enough to establish her independence with a solidity she had not previously had. She deposited it in a savings account and allowed it to grow while she continued working. She took one more governor's position in 1890, with a family in Evanston, and then another in 1893, and then she retired from the work in 1898 at the age of 43, having decided that she had saved enough and managed carefully enough that she did not need to continue. The cottage in Evanston was on a quiet street 2 blocks from the lake. It had a garden in the back and a kitchen large enough to work in comfortably, and a sitting room that received the afternoon light from the west. She planted tomatoes and asters in the garden and kept a large orange cat named Provision, which was her private joke, understood by no one who met the cat. The employment journals were on the shelf above the writing table in the sitting room. She had 13 volumes by the time she retired, 13 years of what you were promised, and what you were paid, and what your duties are. The 1886 volume was in the middle of the row, distinguished from the others only by its date on the spine. She had brought it to Miss Cavendish's office in 1889 when they first met. Miss Cavendish had read the October 22nd entry and then set the journal down and said, "This is exactly the kind of record that wins cases." Hattie had said she had not kept it thinking she would need it to win a case. Miss Cavendish had said they never do. That's what makes it credible. Beatrice Alderton wrote every autumn through the years after 1889 and into the new century and beyond. She was in Milwaukee by the time she was 20, married, and later had children of her own whom she described in the letters with the specificity of someone who had been well taught to observe. She always asked about the garden and the cat and whatever Hattie had been reading. She never mentioned the bequest explicitly in the letters, but she had asked her mother about it in 1889. Hattie had learned from the parlour maid who remained in the Alderton household, did Miss Goss get what father left her? And her mother had said, she did, and Beatrice had said, good. Good. One word, and the right one. Hattie thought about it sometimes in the evenings, when she sat in the chair by the west window with her tea and the cat on the arm of the chair and the journals on the shelf. Not with grief or with vindication, but with the quiet satisfaction of something that had worked the way it was supposed to work. A man had kept his word. She had kept her record. The record had made it possible for the word to be honoured even after the man who gave it was no longer there to insist on it himself. This was, in her view, what records were for. The autumn letters from Beatrice arrived each year without fail. Hattie answered them in kind. Her tomatoes, the cat, what she'd been reading, observations about the neighbourhood and the weather, and the small events of a quiet life. The letters were not long. They did not need to be long. They were what a correspondence was when both parties understood its purpose, which was to keep a thread alive between people who had been important to each other during a particular season of their lives. The thread was still there when Hattie died in Evanston in 1922 at the age of 67, in the cottage she had owned for 24 years. The employment journals were found on the shelf by the executor she had named in her will. They were 13 volumes of plain cloth-covered notebooks dated on the spine. The executor, a lawyer by profession, read the 1886 volume at Hattie's attorney's recommendation, and then read 3 others, and then set them down and said nothing for a moment. He said these are remarkable records. Her attorney said she thought record-keeping was a professional obligation. He said she was right. The journals were donated, at the attorney's suggestion, to the records collection of a Chicago History Society that was beginning, in those years, to collect materials relating to the professional lives of women in the 19th century. They are there still, in the collection, filed under the heading Domestic Professional Records, 1878 to 1898. The 1886 volume is in the middle of the row. October 22nd is on page 37. The schoolroom in the Alderton house on Lakeshore Drive was on the 3rd floor, a room with 2 north-facing windows that let in the good flat light of the lake in winter, white and abundant in snowlight, grey and steady and overcast, and with bookshelves on 3 walls that Hattie had organised in her first week and had maintained in the same organisation for 9 years. The organisation was by subject rather than by size, which some people found incorrect but which made sense if the shelves' purpose was to help a child find a book about a subject, rather than to create a symmetrical row of matched heights. She had always organised things by purpose rather than by appearance. This was a general principle that had settled into habit deep enough that she no longer thought about it. She arranged things the way that they would be most useful to the people who needed to use them. The employment journal was organised by date, because employment information was most usefully retrieved by when it occurred, rather than by what kind of information it was. If she wanted to know what her salary had been in 1882, she looked in the 1882 volume. If she wanted to know about the October 1886 conversation in the library, she looked in the 1886 volume under October. The organisation was simple and it was reliable, and it had worked, in the specific instance where it needed to work, exactly as it was supposed to. Miss Cavendish had been practising in Chicago for 4 years by the time Hattie came to see her. She was 31, a graduate of the Union College of Law, building a practice methodically in the way of someone who knows that methodical building is the only kind that lasts. She had handled estate matters before, usually helping women understand what they were inheriting rather than helping them recover what they were owed, and the Alderton situation was a variant of the second kind, which she approached with the thoroughness that the first kind had taught her. When Hattie brought her the employment journal on their first meeting, and showed her the October 22nd, 1886 entry, Miss Cavendish had read it twice, and then set the journal down and said it was the kind of record that wins cases. Hattie had said she'd not kept it thinking she would need it to win a case. Miss Cavendish had said they never do. She had meant, Hattie thought afterward, that the records most useful in legal proceedings are not the records made for legal proceedings. They are the records made because someone was paying attention in a continuous and systematic way, and which therefore reflect what actually happened rather than what someone decided to record after a problem arose. The employment journal was a record of how things had actually been. It reflected in the October 22nd, 1886 entry, an ordinary conversation on an ordinary evening, recorded not because there was any legal significance attached to it at the time of recording, but because it was professional information that might be relevant later. It had been relevant later. The $3,000 changed Hattie's life in the practical and specific way that money changes lives when it arrives at the right moment. She was 34, she had savings, but not enough to retire at 34 in the way she intended, in a cottage with a garden, without the obligation to manage someone else's children or household for the rest of her working years. She did not retire immediately. She worked for another 9 years, taking 2 final positions with the steadiness of someone who has a plan and is executing it, rather than with the anxiety of someone who is working because they have to. The Evanston cottage was on a street of similar cottages, small and well-maintained, the kind of neighbourhood where people lived because they wanted to be in a place with a certain quality. She had a vegetable garden in the back, and a perennial border along the front fence and the orange cat provision on the arm of the chair in the sitting room in the evenings. These were sufficient things. She had always known they would be sufficient if she could arrange them, and she had arranged them. The annual letters from Beatrice were the most reliable continuity in her retired life. Beatrice wrote every autumn with the discipline of a woman who had apparently never forgotten that a letter written in October would arrive in November and brighten the month for the person who received it. The letters described Milwaukee, her children, her husband, the book she had read. They were not long letters, but they were specific, and specificity in a letter is what makes it feel like a real account rather than a formality. Hattie answered each one in kind. She described the garden, the cat, what she was reading, the quality of the season. She did not write about the 1889 proceedings. Beatrice never asked, and the reason she never asked was probably that she already knew. She had heard that Miss Goss had received what father left her, and this had been settled in her mind as settled, and there was no need to open it again in letters. This seemed right to Hattie. The proceedings had been settled. The codicil had spoken for itself. The documentation had done its work, and the work was done, and what remained was the October letters from Beatrice and the cat on the arm of the chair, and the employment journals on the shelf behind her. She thought sometimes, in the evenings with the west window light softening on the bookshelves, about the difference between the records that prove things and the records that merely remember them. The employment journal was of the first kind. Most records were of the second kind. They remembered what had happened, but they did not particularly prove it, because no one was disputing it. Her garden notes, in the domestic account book, were of the second kind. The record of what had been planted and when and what had come up. She kept them because she liked to know what had happened and because knowing what had happened made it possible to do it better the following year. She kept them not as evidence of anything, but as memory made durable. This was, she thought, what records were finally for, making durable what would otherwise be lost. The employment journal had made durable the October evening in the library when Thomas Alderton had said he had provided for her. Without the journal, the evening would have remained only in her memory, hers and no one else's. With the journal it could be verified, but either way the evening had been real. The journal had not made it real. It had made it findable. She had made it impossible to erase. She had not known, in October of 1886, that was what she was doing. She had been writing down what had happened because she wrote down what happened. The impossibility of erasure was a consequence of that habit, not an intention of it. The journals are still in the Chicago History Society's collection. The October entry is on page 37. The handwriting is clear, even, consistent throughout. 13 years of the same hand, the same care, the same method. From outside the record it is simply an entry among entries. From inside the record, which is the only place where the significance is visible, it is obvious. This is what happened, on this evening, in this room, and it was written down, and the writing down is what made it possible 30 years later for an archivist to find it and for anyone who reads it to know that it was true. The professional life of a governess in the Gilded Age had a particular shape that Hattie had understood from the beginning. It moved through positions, each one a complete chapter, beginning with the arrival and the establishment of the working relationship and ending with the departure when the children had outgrown the need for a governess, or when the household circumstances changed. Each position was complete in itself. The records from each position were complete in themselves. The employment journal tracked them sequentially, 1 year's volume at a time, the children and the employers and the duties and the salary arrangements building, over the years, into a professional autobiography written in the particular language of domestic employment, rather than in narrative prose. She had not thought of it as an autobiography while she was writing it. She had thought of it as a professional record, which is what it was. But reading through the complete run of volumes in the Evanston cottage in the evenings of her retirement, she found that it read more coherently as a biography of professional life than she had expected. The arc of her work visible in the progression of positions and the changes in the kinds of notes she made, and the growth in the specificity of her observations as she became more experienced. The Alderton household occupied a central section of that arc, 9 years, the longest single position she had held, the most complete record. The 1878 through 1887 volumes covered Clara's time in the schoolroom, the years of primary instruction when the work was most varied and most absorbing. The 1887 through 1889 volumes covered the later years, when Thomas Jr. and Beatrice had become her primary responsibilities, and the household's character had begun to shift with Clara's departure for finishing school. The October 1886 volume was in the middle of those years, the third volume of the Alderton section of the record, the volume that covered the year when Thomas Jr. was 11 and increasingly interested in natural history, when Beatrice was 9 and beginning to emerge from the watchful, quiet period of her early childhood into the reading and questioning period that would characterize her through the rest of her schoolroom years, when the household was settled and the work was good and an ordinary October evening in the library had produced the conversation that Hattie had noted and filed and kept. She had thought about that conversation more than once in the years after 1889. Not obsessively, it was not the kind of thing she was inclined to dwell on, but as an example of something worth understanding correctly. Thomas Alderton had told her in October of 1886 that he had made provision for her. He had then spent the next 2 years, he had died in February of 1889, being a man with an industrial chemical business and 3 children, and the usual pressures of a prosperous man's life, and the codicil he had executed in November of 1887 had been filed and forgotten by the people who managed his estate, and had not been presented at the estate reading because no one had thought to ask whether it existed. No one had thought to ask because no one knew to ask. Greer had not known there was a codicil for Harriet Ruth Goss because he had not known that Thomas had told her there would be one. Mrs. Alderton had not known. Hatch had presumably known, since he had drafted and filed the codicil, but he had not volunteered the information, apparently because it did not occur to him to volunteer it. The codicil was in the file, the reading was conducted, and if no one asked about Harriet Ruth Goss, perhaps it had simply not risen to the top of the pile of things that needed to be communicated. The employment journal had solved this problem, not by proving that the codicil existed, the probate court records had proved that, but by establishing the prior conversation from which the codicil had originated, and by making it possible for Hattie to engage an attorney with a specific documented claim, rather than a vague sense that something had been promised. The specific documented claim had made the right questions easier to ask. She wondered sometimes whether she would have found the codicil without the journal. She thought she probably would have. She was a methodical person, and she would eventually have asked the probate court directly whether any codicils existed. But the journal had made her certain enough of what she knew to ask the question rather than to simply accept Greer's assessment and leave. The journal had given her the certainty that warranted the question. This was the journal's practical function in that instance. Its practical function in the preceding 9 years had been simply to record what happened. The 9 years of recording had produced, incidentally, the one entry that turned out to matter. This was how records worked when they were kept honestly and continuously. They contained everything that had happened, and most of it did not matter in any external sense, and then occasionally one thing did matter. And because the records contained everything, the thing that mattered was in there. The Evanston cottage had a garden that she had maintained since the year she moved in. She had gardened since childhood, in the small way available to someone who lives in rented rooms, in window boxes and borrowed strips of ground, and when she had her own garden for the first time she had approached it with the same systematic attention she brought to everything else. The soil tested, the drainage assessed, the plants chosen for the specific conditions of the specific location rather than for what she happened to prefer in the abstract. The tomatoes went on the south-facing fence, where they got the most sun. The herbs went near the kitchen door for easy access when cooking. The asters went in the border along the front walk, where they would flower in September and October when most other things had finished, filling the weeks when the garden otherwise would have been bare. She had planned the garden on paper the winter before she planted it, sitting at the writing table in the cottage's sitting room, with a scale drawing of the garden and a list of what she intended to plant and where. The planning was, she supposed, the same impulse as the employment journal and the household account books, the desire to think a thing through before committing to it, to understand the structure of a situation before placing things within the structure. A garden planned on paper in February could be adjusted in February without the cost of having planted something in the wrong place in May. A professional arrangement documented in a journal when it was established could be verified later without the cost of having relied on memory alone. She had planted the garden, and it had grown in approximately the way she had planned it, with the adjustments that any plan requires when it meets actual conditions. The tomatoes had been more productive than expected because the south fence court reflected heat from the neighbour's wall. The asters had been less productive than expected because a late June cold snap had damaged the early growth. She had noted these things and adjusted her planning for the following year. This was the kind of learning that records made possible, the specific comparison between what had been planned and what had occurred, year after year, producing a progressively more accurate understanding of the specific conditions of the specific garden. She had been gardening in the Evanston cottage for 24 years by the time she died. She knew the garden the way she had known the Alderton schoolroom after 9 years, as a specific place with specific characteristics that she had learned through continuous attention and recorded in the book she kept. The garden notes were in the domestic account book, alongside the household budget and the account of her personal finances. Someone reading those books would find, interspersed with the regular monthly accounts, notes about the tomatoes and the asters and the herb garden and what had worked and what had not, and what she intended to change the following year. These notes were of no legal significance. They would not help anyone prove anything. They were simply what had happened in the garden, written down so that she could remember it and learn from it and do it better. This was the other thing records were for, the thing that was separate from the legal utility of the employment journal and more like the utility of any continuous account of a life. They were for learning, for being able to say, this is what I tried, and this is what happened, and this is what I understand now that I did not understand before, for being able to make the next year better than the year before, because the year before was written down accurately. She'd done this in the employment journal, and in the household accounts and in the garden notes. She had been doing it since her mother had shown her the principle at 17 in the context of a domestic budget, and she'd continued doing it in every context where it applied, which was, she had found, most contexts. The world was full of things that benefited from being written down accurately and reviewed later, and full of people who did not write them down, and were therefore unable to learn from them in the specific grounded way that only the written record makes possible. The Evanston cottage was sold after her death. The garden was incorporated into the new owner's use of the property. The asters bloomed in September of 1922, as they had bloomed every September since 1898, indifferent to the change in who was tending them, continuing the pattern that had been established by someone who had planned them into the border for exactly this purpose, the filling of the weeks when most other things had finished. The Alderton house on Lakeshore Drive was sold in 1908, when Mrs. Alderton moved to a smaller house in the Lincoln Park neighbourhood that better suited a widow's establishment. The schoolroom on the 3rd floor became a storage room, and then a sleeping porch, and then, over the decades, simply a room whose previous purpose was no longer apparent from its current use. The bookshelves that Hattie had organised in her first week remained on 3 walls of the room for several years after the sale, maintained by whoever occupied the house as useful pieces of furniture rather than as the organised professional library they had once been. The books were dispersed, The shelf organisation dissolved. The room became something else. This was as it should be. The schoolroom's function had been completed. Clara and Thomas Jr. and Beatrice had learned what they had needed to learn in it, and the teacher who had organised those shelves and maintained that organisation, and recorded each year of work in the employment journal that sat under her bed on Clark Street, had moved on to the next position, and the next one after that, and eventually to the cottage in Evanston with the garden and the cat and the 13 volumes of professional record in a leather case. The schoolroom was a room. The record was the thing that lasted. The record said what had happened there, in the library, on an October evening in 1886, and the record had said it clearly enough that a woman who had never seen the inside of that house could read it 33 years later in a Chicago History Society archive and know exactly what Thomas Alderton had told Harriet Goss on that evening and why it had mattered. The Fairweather estate in Dutchess County occupied a particular fold in the Hudson Valley landscape, a curve in the river valley that caught the late afternoon light at a slant that made the fields look, in summer, as if they were generating their own illumination. This was the effect of the quality of the soil, which was dark and river-enriched, and the way the surrounding hills sheltered the valley from the afternoon shadow until the very end of the day. Ruth Mosner had watched this light move across the same fields for 31 years, season by season, in the particular intimate way of someone who has spent enough time in one place that its rhythms have become their own. She had arrived in the spring of 1866, 24 years old, in the year after the war ended, when the whole country was still in the process of understanding what it had become. She had come by rail from Poughkeepsie, where she had spent the previous 3 years as a housekeeper in a doctor's house, and before that she had worked in 2 other houses in Dutchess County and 1 in Columbia County, accumulating the experience and the reputation that had brought her to the attention of Cornelia Fairweather. Cornelia Fairweather was, in 1866, 61 years old, and the managing presence of a 470-acre estate that she had held together through 4 years of war largely by herself, while her son Silas was absent, and the regular flow of male agricultural labour had been interrupted by conscription. She had managed the estate before the war with her husband, and she had managed it after his death in 1860, with Silas's assistance, and she had managed it during the war alone, and the management in each phase had been essentially the same management, thorough, systematic, and based on the maintenance of clear records of everything the estate produced and everything it consumed. Cornelia told Ruth, at their first meeting, that she required a housekeeper who could keep accounts without needing to be told how and who understood that the household records and the estate records were connected, not separate. She said she had found, over many years of managing a property of this scale, that the line between the house and the farm was not as clear in the accounts as it was in the architecture, and that a housekeeper who treated the kitchen garden as one thing and the kitchen as another was a housekeeper who would produce accounts that did not reconcile. Ruth said she understood. She had been keeping accounts since she was 17. She was comfortable with reconciliation. She was hired. The estate office was a small room off the kitchen passage, with a north-facing window that let in the cool grey light that accountants and bookkeepers have always found useful. Cornelia had maintained the estate's records there in a series of ledgers that went back to her husband's time, and Ruth took over the maintenance of those records on her first week, adding her own entries to the columns that Cornelia had established, using the same categories and the same format, so that the record continued without visible interruption. She worked under Cornelia for 8 years. Cornelia died in the autumn of 1874 at the age of 69, of a heart failure that came in the evening while she was reviewing the summer's apple harvest accounts. Silas found her at her desk with the ledger still open in front of her. Ruth thought, when she heard this, that there were worse ways to leave. Silas Fairweather was 49 in 1874. He was a bachelor who had never particularly wanted to be a bachelor, and had become one by the gradual accumulation of circumstances, a broken engagement in 1850, a long period of indifference to the subject, and then the war and the management of the estate in the post-war years, which between them had consumed the seasons when men of his age and disposition typically made domestic arrangements. By 1874 he had settled into his solitary life with the resigned comfort of someone who has made peace with the current arrangement without quite endorsing it. He was, as an employer, genial and sometimes imprecise. Genial in that he was genuinely kind to the people who worked for him, and interested in their welfare and willing to pay well for good work. Imprecise in that he had a tendency to make arrangements informally, a handshake, a verbal agreement, a nod over the supper table, and then assume that these arrangements were understood and remembered by all parties without the need for documentation. This had worked adequately during his mother's lifetime because Cornelia had documented everything that Silas agreed to verbally. After her death, the documentation of Silas's informal arrangements became Ruth's responsibility, and she took it seriously. When Silas agreed, at the gate to the lower pasture in the spring of 1878, that the tenant farmer Hawkins could expand his use of the North Cottage outbuildings for his sheep operation in exchange for an additional $10 per quarter rent, Ruth wrote it down that evening. When Silas told the orchard manager, a man named Peake, in 1885, that he could plant additional apple varieties in the southeast corner of the orchard on his own account in exchange for a 30% share of any sale revenues from those varieties, Ruth wrote it down. When Silas agreed, over a dinner table conversation in 1892, that Peake could use the estate's cider press and equipment to expand into commercial cider production, in exchange for a 20% share of the cider revenues, Ruth wrote it down. She did not write these things down because she suspected anything was wrong. She wrote them down because the estate office records were the record of what the estate agreed to and what the estate received, and an agreement that was not written down was an agreement that could be remembered differently by different people at some future point when it was not convenient to remember it the same way. She had learned this principle early in her working life, and she had not seen any reason to revise it in 30 years of practice. The bookcase in the estate office held, by 1896, 30 years of records in the format Cornelia had established, and Ruth had continued. The annual ledgers on the upper shelves, bound in brown cloth, dated on the spine, recording by month the income and expenditures of the estate's operation. Below them the quarterly subsidiary books, one for the orchard, one for the tenant cottages, one for the greenhouse and cut flower operation, which Ruth had begun as a separate account when the greenhouse income became significant enough in the 1880s to warrant it. At the bottom of the bookcase, the wooden box of receipts and invoices, organised by year in paper envelopes, the invoices from the contractors and the suppliers and the Poughkeepsie florists and the farriers and the well drillers and everyone else who had done business with the estate in the preceding 3 decades. There was also the correspondence file. This was separate from the ledgers, maintained in a series of cardboard folders in the drawer below the bookcase. Every letter that had passed through the estate office in relation to the estate's business was in those folders. Letters from the Poughkeepsie florists confirming seasonal pricing, letters from the tenant farmers about repairs to the cottages, letters from the coal merchant, letters from Silas's attorneys about various matters over the years, and most recently the letter from the Consolidated Coal and Coke Company inquiry about certain geological features of the estate's western hillside that had attracted a survey team's attention in 1893. She had kept that letter because it concerned the property, and she kept all correspondence concerning the property. Silas Fairweather died in April of 1896 of a pulmonary complaint that had been developing through the winter, and that his physician had hoped would resolve with warm weather but did not. He was 72 years old. He had never married. He had no children. He had 2 nephews and a first cousin once removed in Kingston, whose existence was known to a small number of people in Dutchess County's legal and social circles. The will was dated 1889. It had been prepared by his attorney in Poughkeepsie, a man named Horn, who had been handling Silas's legal affairs for 20 years and who knew them to be somewhat loosely organised. The will left the estate property to Aldous Fairweather, the son of Silas's brother Frederick. A codicil from 1893 left certain personal property to Clement Fairweather, the son of Silas's sister Agnes. A second codicil from 1895 left what the instrument described as the property rights associated with the greenhouse and cut flower operation to a Helen Fairweather of Kingston, who was identified as a first cousin once removed. Ruth was not named. This was not a surprise. She had never expected to be named. She had a month's wages outstanding, and the return of a small personal loan she had made to Silas in 1894, $40, to cover an emergency repair to the main house boiler that had needed attention before the winter, which Silas had acknowledged in writing at her request, producing a letter in his own hand confirming the amount and the terms of repayment. She had kept the letter in the correspondence file. Aldous arrived in May with a brisk and managerial air. He was 43, a hardware merchant from Albany, a man who understood inventory and supply chains and the management of staff, which were useful skills for a man inheriting an estate, and somewhat different from the skills required to manage a 470-acre property in Dutchess County, though he did not appear to be aware of this distinction. He was not unkind to Ruth. He was simply not informed about the depth of what she knew. He brought an estate agent named Poole, engaged to prepare the inventory for the probate proceeding. Poole was a competent man of a particular type. He was good at seeing what he was shown and less good at identifying what he had not been shown. He moved through the estate over the course of 3 weeks in June, examining the property and the buildings and the equipment, and asking questions of Aldous, and occasionally of the outdoor staff, and occasionally of Ruth. His questions of Ruth were specific but not wide-ranging. He asked about the current tenant arrangements, the greenhouse operation, the cut flower sales, the orchard income. She answered each question accurately and completely, and did not volunteer information about questions he had not asked. She was not being unhelpful. She was answering the questions that were put to her. If Poole did not ask about the cider operation, she could not answer a question about it. If Poole did not ask whether the orchard income figures he was using were current, she could not correct a figure that had not been presented to her. She noticed that the draft inventory, when it appeared on the estate office table one afternoon in late June while Poole was in Poughkeepsie, was using tenant rent rates from 1884, not the adjusted rates from 1889 and 1892. She noticed that the orchard income figures were lower than the actual receipts in the quarterly ledger for the preceding 3 years. She noticed that the cider operation, which had been producing income since 1892, a portion of which accrued to Peak, and a portion of which accrued to the estate, was not on the inventory at all. She also noticed that the personal loan from 1894 was not listed among the estate's receivables. She went to the bookcase. She pulled the annual ledger for 1884 and the annual ledger for 1889. She set them side by side and found the relevant entries. The difference in the tenant rent rates was clear in the entries for the first quarter of each year, the 1884 figure and then the 1889 figure, which reflected Hawkins' expanded use of the outbuildings and the adjusted rate Silas had agreed to at the gate to the lower pasture. She pulled the quarterly orchard books for 1893, 1894 and 1895. She found the actual income figures, which were higher than Poole's estimate. She found the receipts from the Poughkeepsie florists that supported those figures. She pulled the correspondence file. She found the letter documenting the cider operation arrangement with Peak, dated October 1892. She found the estate's own quarterly records showing the cider income and the 20% distributed to Peak and the remaining 80% recorded to the estate. She found Silas's letter about the personal loan dated March 1894. She took all of this to Horn on a Wednesday morning in July. She came to his office on the main street of Poughkeepsie, with the relevant ledgers in a cloth bag and the correspondence file in a flat case she had used to carry documents between the estate office and town since 1872. She laid everything on Horn's desk with the systematic order of someone who has organised this material for review. Horn was an experienced man. He had been reviewing estate accounts for more than 20 years. He read everything Ruth had brought with the careful attention of a man who knows that what he is looking at is important. He asked her several questions, each of which she answered with reference to a specific document. He compared Poole's draft inventory to the ledger figures. He read the cider arrangement letter. He read Silas's personal loan acknowledgement. When he finished, he looked at Ruth across his desk. He asked how she had come to keep records this complete. She said she'd always kept complete records. She said that was what the estate office records were for, to record what the estate received and what it paid and what it agreed to, so that anyone who needed to know could find out from the records rather than from memory. He asked whether she'd kept them this completely throughout her tenure. She said she had. She had kept them in the format Cornelia Fairweather had established in 1866, and which she had continued without alteration. She said Cornelia had believed that incomplete records were more dangerous than no records at all, because they created the illusion of knowledge while concealing gaps, and that she had agreed with this view from her first week. Horn was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would revise the inventory. He filed the revised inventory with the surrogate court. The supplementary affidavit he prepared identified Ruth as the source of the corrected figures and described the estate records from which the corrections were drawn. The surrogate court accepted the revised inventory as the basis for the probate proceeding. The proceeding itself was contentious in the ways that probate proceedings among competing nephews tended to be in those years. Clement challenged the 1889 will's primacy. Helen Fairweather's claim to the greenhouse operation required its own determination. These disputes moved through the surrogate court over the winter of 1896 and into 1897, producing a written opinion in the spring that was, among its several findings, notable for its explicit acknowledgement of the estate records maintained by Ruth Mosner. She read the opinion when Horne sent her a copy. She was 55 years old and had been keeping the estate records for 31 of those years. The opinion noted that the records represented an unusually complete and reliable accounting of an estate's affairs. She read the sentence twice. She thought it was accurate. The outstanding wages were paid in January of 1897. The personal loan was returned in February, with a brief additional note from Horne's office confirming the calculation of interest at the rate Silas had acknowledged. The full amount was correct to the penny. Ruth remained at the estate through the probate proceedings, managing the house and the greenhouse and the orchard accounts with the same careful attention she had always given them, working through the winter and into the spring without drama. When Aldous took formal possession in April of 1897 and arrived from Albany with his family and his own household staff, she packed the estate office with the systematic efficiency she brought to all packing: ledgers by year, quarterly books in their series, the correspondence file in its flat case, the wooden box of receipts in the acid-free container she had purchased from the Poughkeepsie stationer. Aldous thanked her for her service. He offered her a reference, which she accepted. He offered her extended accommodation at the estate while she made her arrangements, which she declined politely. She had a room waiting at a boarding house on Main Street in Poughkeepsie, with a woman she'd known for many years, and she preferred to make the transition cleanly. She moved to Poughkeepsie on a Tuesday in April. The wooden box of receipts went with her, in the cab she had hired for the purpose. The ledgers she left behind, they were the estate's records and belonged with the estate, and Aldous' new household management would need them for reference. But the wooden box was her work, and she kept it. In the boarding-house room she put the box on the shelf above the writing table. Below the box she arranged her books, and below the books she laid out her own household accounts, her personal accounts, kept in the same format as the estate records, because it was the only format she knew and it was a format that worked. She reviewed the accounts that first evening. Everything balanced. She made a note. April 8th, 1897. Fairweather Estate settled. Personal effects transferred to Main Street rooms. Accounts current. Next review. May 1st. She closed the book and made a cup of tea. Outside the boarding-house window the Main Street of Poughkeepsie moved in its April way. Carts and carriages and the occasional automobile beginning to appear in those years, pedestrians in the strengthening spring light, the ordinary commerce of an ordinary afternoon. She had lived in this county for 31 years, and she knew its pace and its character the way you know a place when you have attended to it long enough. The Fairweather orchard was blooming that April, 4 miles north of where she sat. She had watched it bloom 30 times. She would not see it bloom again. This seemed, in the way of things that are over, correct. You're in a place for the time you're in it, and then you're somewhere else, and the place continues to be what it is without you, as it was before you arrived. She had arrived in 1866 with her account books and her method. She left in 1897 with her account books and her method. In between, 31 years of what happened had been written down and kept in the estate office bookcase, in the cool grey light of the north-facing window, in the format that Cornelia Fairweather had established before Ruth arrived, and that would outlast them both. The records had kept the estate honest. The records had kept the probate proceeding accurate. The records had returned to Ruth what was owed to her. And then she had carried the part that was hers to a room on Main Street in Poughkeepsie and put it on a shelf, because records belong in an ordered place, and because what has been written down and kept is never entirely lost. The surrogate court's written opinion remained in the court's files. The estate ledgers remained in the Fairweather estate office, which Aldous' new housekeeper would take over and maintain in her own way. The wooden box of receipts remained on Ruth's shelf until she died in 1914 at the age of 72. in a small house she had purchased in Poughkeepsie in 1902, when the boarding house had become less convenient than her own four walls. Her will, drafted by a Poughkeepsie attorney in 1910, left the wooden box and its contents to the Dutchess County Historical Society, with a note in her own hand explaining that the receipts covered the period 1866 to 1896 and pertained to the Fairweather estate property, and might be of interest to anyone studying the agricultural and commercial life of that period. The Historical Society accepted the donation. The archivist who processed it in 1914 wrote, in the acquisition notes, "Unusually complete collection, 30 years unbroken." The Fairweather estate in Dutchess County had a particular quality in the late afternoon that Ruth Mostner had always found difficult to describe to people who had not seen it. It was something about the angle of the light and the quality of the soil, and the way the surrounding hills held the valley, so that the fields seemed to illuminate themselves from within rather than simply receiving the sun's illumination. She had watched this effect move across the same fields for 31 years, season by season, and she knew it the way you know something when you've been paying attention to it long enough that it has become part of your perception. She had come to the estate with her account books and her method, and she had left with her account books and her method, and in between those two events she had kept records that were accurate and complete and continuous for 31 years, without gaps and without degradation in quality. This was not remarkable to her. It was simply what she had done, in the format she had been taught, for the length of time she had responsibility for it. The principle she had arrived at early in her working life and had never revised was this: you write it down when it happens, not when you remember to write it down. You file it when it arrives, not when you have time to file it. You check the balance when the month ends, not when something seems wrong. These were not difficult principles. They required only the consistent application of a habit, and habits, once formed, are their own enforcement mechanism. The discomfort of not doing the thing becomes greater than the effort of doing it. Horne had been a probate attorney for long enough to know the difference between records that reflected what had been convenient to record and records that reflected what had actually happened. Ruth's records were clearly in the second category. They were not organised for persuasion. They were organised for accuracy, in the format of a working estate office rather than in the format of a document assembled for a legal proceeding. This was, in itself, the most persuasive thing about them. Records made to be convincing often fail to convince, because the selection of what to record reveals the recorder's interest. Records made to be accurate are convincing precisely because they contain the things that were inconvenient to record as readily as the things that were convenient. The estate's cider revenues in years when the apple crop had been poor were in the ledgers. The contractor invoice for a repair that had cost more than estimated was in the receipt box. The letter from a tenant farmer who had paid his rent late was in the correspondence file alongside the letters from tenant farmers who had paid on time. None of these things were flattering to the estate's management in those specific instances. They were in the records because they had happened, and the records recorded what happened. This completeness was what Horne had meant when he said she had kept unusually complete records. He had not meant that she had recorded more things than most housekeepers. He had meant that she had recorded what had actually happened, consistently, including the things that had not gone entirely smoothly, and that this consistency produced a record that could be trusted in a way that a selected record could not be. She settled into the Poughkeepsie boarding house, and then into the house she bought in 1902, and she kept her personal accounts with the same regular attention she had given to the estate's accounts. First Sunday of each month, the account book open at the writing table, income and expenditures and the closing balance confirmed. The balance was always as expected because she spent within her income, which was a simple rule that prevented the kind of imbalance that required explaining to oneself later. She had money enough for her life as she intended to live it. The returned loan, the outstanding wages, the savings from 31 years of careful management of her own affairs. Combined, these produced a sum that would support a modest life indefinitely if managed as she managed things, which was conservatively. She did not require a great deal. She had never required a great deal. She required organised surroundings sufficient to eat, books to read, and the satisfaction of work done well. The Poughkeepsie house had a garden that required some work in the first year before it produced reliably. She gave it that attention. She planted tomatoes and beans and asters and a small herb garden near the kitchen door. She organised the office room with the writing table under the window, and the personal account books in the drawer, and the wooden receipt box on the shelf beside the books. She reviewed the accounts on the first Sunday of each month. She noted that they balanced. She filed the month's receipts. She made tea and sat by the window where the afternoon light came in from the south, and read for an hour before starting the supper. This was the rhythm of her retired life, and it suited her in the way that rhythms suit people who have always organised their time deliberately rather than allowing it to arrange itself. She donated the wooden receipt box to the Dutchess County Historical Society in 1913, the year before she died, when she was reorganising the office room and decided that the receipts had been kept long enough and deserved to go somewhere they would continue to be kept. She wrote the note in her own hand explaining their provenance and potential interest. The archivist's acquisition note said 30 years unbroken. This was accurate. Ruth had never broken the sequence, not in good years and not in difficult ones, not when the estate's affairs were uncomplicated and not when they were not. The apple orchard at the Fairweather estate bloomed each spring for many years after 1896. The greenhouse continued to supply the Poughkeepsie florists with cut flowers on a year-round basis. The tenant cottages continued to produce their rental income. The estate had been well managed for long enough that its management had become self-sustaining. The systems in place, the relationships established, the income reliable. Ruth had been part of this for 31 years. She had left and it had continued. This was, she thought, the proper outcome. The records should outlast the person who keeps them. The systems should outlast the person who builds them. The work that was worth doing in a way that persisted beyond the doing of it. Her ledgers were in the estate office bookcase and would remain there. Her receipt box was in the Historical Society's collection and would remain there. What had been written down and kept was never entirely lost. The Hudson Valley Light moves across the Fairweather fields every afternoon at the same angle it has always moved, in the late afternoon when the surrounding hills finally release their shadow and the fields briefly generate what looks like their own illumination. Someone watches this now who was not there when Ruth watched it. The fields continue to produce. The river continues to run. The receipt box is in the Historical Society's collection, organised by year, 30 years unbroken, exactly as she left it. She died in the Poughkeepsie house in 1914, at the age of 72, in the room where the morning light came through the south window onto the writing table. The account book was in the drawer. The first Sunday of the preceding month she had reviewed the accounts. They had balanced. She had noted that they balanced. She had closed the book and made tea. All in order, nothing missing that ought to be there, nothing there that ought to be missing. The estate office bookcase had stood against the east wall of the small room off the kitchen passage for as long as anyone at the Fairweather estate could remember. It had been there when Cornelia Fairweather's husband built the 1848 main house, installed as a working piece of furniture in a working room rather than as a decorative piece in a reception room, and it had remained there through the subsequent additions of 1862 and 1881 and through the 31 years of Ruth Mosner's tenure, accumulating the ledgers in their brown cloth bindings one by one as each year was completed and the volume was closed and set in place. The bookcase was 7 shelves high and 5 feet wide, made of oak that had darkened over the decades to the colour of old tea. The ledgers occupied the top 3 shelves, arranged chronologically from left to right on each shelf, with the earliest years at the left end of the top shelf and the most recent year at the right end of the third shelf. The quarterly subsidiary books occupied the 4th and 5th shelves, organised by category: orchard, greenhouse, tenants, and then by year within each category. The smaller correspondence and transaction files occupied the 6th shelf. The wooden receipt box occupied the bottom, below the shelves proper, on the floor of the bookcase's base. Ruth had organised the bookcase in this way in her first year, when she and Cornelia had reviewed the records together and determined what needed to be accessible quickly and what could be filed more deeply. The organisation had remained unchanged through 31 years because it had worked, and there was no reason to change what worked. The most recent ledger was always at the right end of the 3rd shelf. The current year's receipts were always in the wooden box. A person who needed any specific record could find it in the time it took to walk to the bookcase and look in the right location. This was the point of an organisation that did not change. It could be navigated without needing to understand how the current occupant of the office had arranged things. It could be navigated by anyone who had been told the system once, and it could be navigated by the person who had been told the system once and had returned to it after an absence, because the system had not changed in the absence. Poole, the estate agent, had not been told the system. He had arrived at the Fairweather estate to prepare an inventory without knowing that the estate office contained 30 years of records organised in a system that would have answered most of his questions directly if he had known where to look. This was not Poole's fault. Aldous had not told him about the estate office records because Aldous did not know what the estate office records contained or how they were organised. He knew that there was an estate office and that the housekeeper managed it, and that accounts were kept there. But the specifics of what was in the bookcase had not been a subject of conversation between Ruth and Aldous in the week since he had arrived to take possession. She had not raised it because she had not been asked. She had answered the questions Poole asked her, accurately and completely. She had not volunteered information about questions he had not asked, because that was not what he had engaged her to do. When she read the draft inventory and found the discrepancies, she did not think of her response as a correction of Poole's work. She thought of it as the application of accurate information to a situation that had been built on inaccurate information, which was simply what you did when you had the accurate information and the situation required it. The difference in the tenant rent rates was a straightforward factual matter. The 1884 rate was a historical figure, the 1889 rate was the current figure. The ledger showed both. Anyone who looked at the ledger would see the difference. The question was simply whether anyone had looked at the ledger. The cider operation was a more complex case. It did not appear in any of the estate's official records because it had been established informally. A supper table conversation in October of 1892, confirmed in writing by Silas the following morning, recorded in Ruth's correspondence file. Poole had not found the correspondence file because he had not been shown the correspondence file. The correspondence file was in the bottom drawer of the desk in the estate office, filed in the folder marked 1892-correspondence, and unless you knew it was there and went specifically to look for it, you would not find it. She knew it was there. She had put it there. She went and found it and brought it to Horn's office with the ledgers, and Horn had read it, and the cider operation had appeared in the revised inventory. The simplest way to describe what had happened was, Ruth had the information. Poole did not. The inventory should have been based on accurate information. Ruth had provided the accurate information. The inventory had been corrected. This was the entire story of the estate records portion of the Fairweather probate proceedings, stripped of its significance in the surrogate court's written opinion and its interest to subsequent historians of the Hudson Valley. The surrogate court's opinion noted that the records maintained by the housekeeper Ruth Mosner represented an unusually complete and reliable accounting of an estate's affairs. This was accurate but slightly misses the point, which was not the completeness of the records but the continuity of the method. The records were complete because the method of keeping them had been applied consistently, year after year, without gaps, to every transaction and every agreement and every letter that passed through the estate office. The completeness was a consequence of the consistency. The consistency was a consequence of the method. The method was a consequence of a woman who had been taught, early in her professional life, that incomplete records were more dangerous than no records at all, because they created the illusion of knowledge while concealing gaps. Cornelia had taught her this in 1866. Ruth had practiced it for 31 years. The practice had produced, incidentally, the complete set of records that the surrogate court found reliable. This was how the best professional practices worked. You did them because they were right, and the consequence of doing them because they were right was that they were also useful when usefulness was required. The boarding house on Main Street in Poughkeepsie was a comfortable establishment run by a woman named Eldridge, who had been managing boarding houses in Dutchess County for 20 years, and who ran her establishment with the same methodical attention that Ruth brought to everything. They got along well. They shared a respect for organizational clarity and a preference for doing things correctly rather than doing them quickly, and these shared preferences made them, after Ruth's first month in the establishment, the kind of companions who do not need to discuss their understanding of one another, because the understanding is already evident in how they each manage their respective responsibilities. Ruth helped Mrs. Eldridge with the establishment's accounts on 2 occasions when Mrs. Eldridge was unwell and the accounts needed attention. She helped in the direct, undemonstrative way of someone who sees what needs doing and does it, explaining the system to Mrs. Eldridge when she recovered, so that the accounts could be maintained by their correct owner rather than by someone helping out. She thought it was important that people understand their own systems. A system you do not understand is a system you cannot maintain, and a system you cannot maintain will eventually fail. Mrs. Eldridge had thanked her, and had seemed to genuinely learn the explanation. The accounts were maintained correctly thereafter. Ruth checked them occasionally, not because she doubted Mrs. Eldridge, but because checking things was what you did to ensure they were in order, and ensuring things were in order was its own occasion regardless of whether anyone else would know you had done it. She stayed in the boarding house for 3 years before buying the house on the north side of Poughkeepsie. 3 years was long enough to be certain of what she wanted in a house, and to save an appropriate amount for the purchase without depleting the savings she had set aside for ordinary living expenses. She approached the house purchase the way she approached every significant transaction. She identified her requirements, found a property that met them, negotiated the price within the range she had determined was appropriate, and completed the purchase with the documentation in order. The documentation was always in order. It had always been in order. It was the thing she knew how to do, the practice she had maintained across every transaction, and every professional responsibility, and every year of her working life, and it did not stop being the thing she knew how to do when the working life ended. It simply applied to a different set of transactions: the house purchase, the personal accounts, the donation of the receipt box to the Historical Society, the will she drafted with a Poughkeepsie attorney in 1910. The will left the house and its contents to a niece in Columbia County, with specific bequests of the receipt box to the Historical Society and her personal account books to the same, for any historical interest they might hold. The attorney had asked, when she mentioned the account books, whether she thought household account books from a retired housekeeper would be of historical interest. She had said she thought 30 years of a woman's personal financial history, maintained in a consistent format with no gaps, might be exactly the kind of document that a historian of ordinary life in the 19th century would want. She said records of ordinary life were rarer than records of extraordinary events, because ordinary life did not produce the occasions that caused records to be preserved. A housekeeper's personal accounts were precisely the kind of thing that would typically be disposed of as household debris after the housekeeper's death, and she thought that was a shame. The attorney had put the account books in the bequest. They went to the Historical Society in 1914 alongside the receipt box. The archivist's notes for both acquisitions mentioned the same quality: complete. 30 years unbroken for the receipt box, 16 years unbroken for the personal accounts. This was accurate. Ruth had never broken the sequence. She had always written it down when it happened and filed it where it could be found, and reviewed it on the schedule she had established for reviewing it. This was all. It was, in the end, simply all. Write it down, file it where it can be found, review it on schedule, do not break the sequence. These were not complicated principles. They did not require exceptional talent or exceptional circumstance. They required consistency, and consistency was available to anyone who decided to practice it. She had decided to practice it at 17, in a farmhouse near Rhinebeck, with her mother's household budget book in her hands. She had practiced it for 55 years. The practice had outlasted her in the records she left behind, which were complete and in order, and available for anyone who wanted to know what had actually happened in one place, over a long time, attended to by someone who thought that what had actually happened deserved to be written down. The parlour is quieter now than when we began. The fire has settled from its earlier brightness into a low, reliable warmth, the kind of warmth that asks nothing of you, that simply continues. The lamp on the side table has burned lower. Outside, the street is the particular dark of a late evening in a city that has mostly gone to sleep, the gas lamps marking the corners in quiet amber intervals, the sound of the occasional carriage fading before it quite arrives. 5 women, 5 cases, 5 different rooms in 5 different cities, a window above a river in Pennsylvania, a study in New Haven, a cedar box on a shelf in Philadelphia, a cottage in Evanston, a boarding house room in Poughkeepsie, each of them sitting at a writing table, or standing before a bookcase, or reading through a letter that has arrived in the Morning Post, each of them having, at some point in the years before any crisis arrived, done the unremarkable thing that turned out to be the necessary thing. They wrote it down, they kept it filed, they read the documents that were placed before them, and did not consider that reading to be someone else's business. They noted what they observed, and they kept the notes, and they returned to the notes when the notes were needed. There is a pattern here, and it is not the pattern of a story. It does not have a villain or a hero or a turning point where everything changed. It has instead a texture, the texture of decades of quiet attention, of a mind that turns habitually toward accuracy, the way a plant turns toward the light, not because a crisis is expected, but because accuracy is simply the preferred condition of things. The Gilded Age was, in many of its official arrangements, not kind to women's property interests. The laws were improving slowly through those years, but improvement is not the same as fairness, and the distance between what the law permitted and what the men around these women assumed remained significant. The women in these cases moved in that space. They did not move in it dramatically. They moved in it the way water moves through stone, slowly, precisely, in the direction the circumstances allowed, over a long enough time to matter. The estate attorney who sat across from Margaret Harlow in 1891, waiting for confusion that did not come. The trustee Storch, arriving at Eleanor Whitmore's house in Youghiogheny expecting a grateful widow and finding a woman who had already read the documents. Greer, who told Hattie Goss there was nothing in the will for her, not knowing about the codicil because he had not thought to look for one. Poole, drafting an inventory from the questions he thought to ask, not knowing that 30 years of answers were in a bookcase 12 feet away. None of these men were wicked. They were, most of them, doing what the era's arrangements invited them to do, what the era's arrangements had always invited men in their position to do, which was to proceed on the assumption that the widows and housekeepers and spinster sisters would be confused or tired, or too grateful for help to notice what the help was costing them. They had simply, in each of these cases, made a mistake about who they were dealing with. These women had outlived the assumption. They had outlived it not by fighting it, and not by luck, but by the slower and less visible method of being more accurate, more thorough, and more patient than anyone around them had needed to be. That's the pattern. 5 cases, 1 pattern. The old money world of the Gilded Age was a world that believed publicly in the incapacity of women to manage their own affairs. These women were, quietly and without public declaration, the refutation of that belief. They left their refutation in the county recorder's offices and the probate courts, and the surrogate's written opinions and the attorney's files, where it remains, patient and exact, for anyone who thinks to look. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this collection of Gilded Age cases, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps us continue making more content like this. The next story will be here when you return. The lamp on the side table has burned very low now. The fire in the grate is a bed of coals. Quiet, still holding their warmth. The pen is still. The parlour is settled. Let the warmth stay with you. Let the cases settle into the comfortable distance of history. Let the names become less distinct, Margaret, Eleanor, Dorothea, Harriet, Ruth, until they are simply women, simply present, simply having done what they did, quietly, over a long time in rooms that were warm and lit and theirs. Sleep well. If you enjoyed this video, we would love to know, was there a particular case that stayed with you? And have you ever found an old document, a letter, or a record from your own family's past that changed how you understood something about them? Leave your answer in the comments, we read everyone. The fire has been burning since the opening of this account quietly, in the grate in the corner of the parlour. It has burned through 5 cases and 5 different cities, and 5 different sets of documents in 5 different drawers and boxes and files. It has burned through the long middle years of these women's lives, the years of reviewing accounts and filing documents, and waiting for moments that sometimes arrived and sometimes did not, and through the resolution of each case and through the reflective passages that followed each resolution. Now it has burned down to coals. The room is still warm. The warmth does not require attention. It is the warmth of something well established, doing what it was set up to do, continuing without assistance. Consider what these 5 women shared, in the deep structure of their cases, beneath the specific legal frameworks and the specific documents and the specific cities they lived in. They each had, at some point, acquired knowledge that they could not immediately use. Margaret Harlow in 1880, reading the Cole survey and making her note. Eleanor Whitmore in 1885 finding the codicil and noting the filing question, Dorothea Frame in 1871 putting the deed in the cedar box because the cedar box was where she put important documents, Harriet Goss in 1886 writing down what Thomas Alderton had told her in the library, Ruth Mossner in 1866 beginning the ledger that Cornelia Fairweather had established and which she would continue for 31 years. In each case, the knowledge was acquired before it was needed. This is the crucial point. The lower drawer was organised before the codicil existed. The cedar box was in place before the fraudulent deed was filed. The employment journal entry was written before the estate reading at which the codicil was absent. The 31-year ledger sequence was begun before Silas Fairweather died, and the probate proceedings required it. The knowledge was already there, already filed, already organised, waiting. Not specifically for the moment it would be needed, because none of these women could have predicted the specific moment, but available for whatever moment required it. This is patience of a very specific kind. It is not the patience of a person who's waiting for something. It is the patience of a person who is doing what they always do, continuously, in a way that produces the conditions under which action becomes possible. It is the patience that underlies all maintenance, of accounts, of records, of gardens, of any system that requires regular attention to remain functional. It is quiet. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply continues. The Gilded Age offered these women very little in the way of official recognition for this kind of work. The maintenance of household records was expected of women of their station, and was therefore unremarkable by the standards of the era. The county recorder's office and the probate court and the surrogate court did not issue citations for particularly well-organised estate files. The history books did not record the names of widows who produced the correct document at the correct moment and thereby secured their income for the remainder of their lives. These women went about their business, and the business went about its business, and the result was that they were adequately provided for in their widowhoods, which was what they had needed to be. What they left behind was the record, Margaret's cedar box in Edmund's house, found in 1940 by a granddaughter, Eleanor's notation book in the drawer of the writing table in the morning room, Dorothea's 1871 deed in the cedar box preserved to 1911, Hattie's employment journals in the Chicago History Society's collection, Ruth's receipt box and personal accounts in the Dutchess County Historical Society. The records outlasted the women who kept them. They are in this sense still present in a way that the women who kept them are not, accessible, verifiable, available for anyone who wants to know what happened. The records know what they know and they say what they say, without anxiety, without impatience, without the kind of urgency that marks human testimony. They simply are what they are, a document filed on a given date recording a given thing, available to be found by the person who knows to look for it and who goes to the right place and looks. This is the deepest thing these cases have in common, not the legal outcomes, which varied in their specifics, not the women's personalities, which were distinct and individual and which have emerged, I hope, in the texture of their stories as something more than a common type, but the quality of attention that each of them brought to their own affairs, and the practice of recording what they observed, and the maintenance of that practice across the years, and the result of that maintenance, which was that when the moment came, the document was there. The document was there. Let that be the last note, the one that carries you out of these 5 cases and into whatever comes next. The document was there because someone put it there, carefully, in a place where it could be found, and did not move it. The ledger balanced because someone checked the figures regularly and did not stop checking them. The record was complete because someone continued it, year after year, without gaps and without degrading it. These are not extraordinary acts. They are the ordinary acts of people who understand that the ordinary acts, performed consistently and well, are what the extraordinary moments rest on. It is late. The coals in the grate are still warm, but they are no longer providing active heat. They are simply holding what warmth they gathered earlier, releasing it slowly into the room the way good records hold the heat of what happened, and release it slowly when it is needed. The lamp on the side table is burning very low. The street outside is quiet. 5 women, 5 houses, 5 lower drawers, cedar boxes, leather cases, wooden receipt boxes, notational books, 5 sets of records that were there when they were needed. Sleep well. Let these women rest in the quiet knowledge of having done what they did, in the rooms where they did it, in the ordinary evenings and mornings of their particular lives. Let the records rest on the shelves where they belong, in order, available, complete. They kept what needed keeping, the keeping was sufficient, the keeping was enough.